Chapter 591. Those trashy officials in the bureau. Huai Chaoshu was not in a good mood. The Federation soldier named Su Lu in front of him was completely different from the description in the intelligence. He was tough, but he was not the pedantic saint who truly carried the banner of morality in his heart. He had never believed that such a person existed in the universe, and now it seemed that it was indeed so. If Su Lu was really a freak saint, perhaps the actions of the Empire in the past few days could have really touched him. To be able to make the war hero that the Federation had spent the most effort to cultivate betray. No, even if it was just to make him doubt himself from the depths of his heart, it would definitely be of great help to the Empire's propaganda in this war. Was it a pity? A little, but it was nothing too pitiful. It was just that there would be another dead body of the Federation in the Empire's territory. In the face of death, many people of the Federation would kneel and beg for mercy, but I've studied you and know that the possibility is not high. The reason why I brought you to see the scenery, and let you listen to this specially arranged history lesson is to strike a blow to the moral superiority of you hypocrites of the Federation. Huai Chaoshu walked out of the campus with his hands behind his back like an old man. His face was expressionless, hiding the pity deep in his heart extremely well. Moral superiority is indeed a very boring thing, Su Lu replied, but I am really interested in this period of history. Before I die, can you satisfy my request and let me see the relevant files of the past? If you want to strike a blow to the moral superiority of the Federation people, this is very necessary. Huai Chaoshu was silent for a moment and nodded. His subordinates disguised as civilians in the crowd behind him immediately left to arrange this matter. The Empire's history textbook was translated into the Federation's language. It took 1 hour and 17 minutes, showing extremely high efficiency. An hour and a half later, Su Lu moved his eyes away from the ebook screen and rubbed his pale face due to weakness. He suddenly opened his mouth and asked, according to your logic, this is the Federation's scheme. But in reality, the previous war, the first space war that you mentioned, we had already prepared for it. If we really had a conspiracy, why would we appear so unprepared? According to the records of the Empire's history books, the Empire had always been cautious when they first came into contact with the Federation. They would never think of attacking the scientific research ships of the Federation. In their opinion, the explosion of the scientific research spaceship was definitely a scheme of the Federation. They even provided relevant evidence to prove that the spaceship could only have been blown up by the Federation themselves. Because in the eyes of the Federation, we are just a bunch of monkeys with outdated technology. Huai Chaoshu coldly replied. You guys are too impatient and underestimate the monkey's ability to resist. It was strange to say that Su Lu should have been enduring endless torture in the Empire's black prison, just like what he had experienced in the past 10 days. However, at this moment he was in the highest class club on planet Liban, having lunch with what was definitely the most respected figure of the Empire. This was a high-rise building in the shape of a deformed mulberry tree. It sparkled under the sunlight. The restaurant on the top floor that had long been cleared was empty. Looking around, one could clearly see the sea of mulberry trees beneath their feet like a green carpet. That's all for the discussion of history. The beginning of a story does not determine the color of the entire story. Even if it is a war related to profit, it is not beyond the scope of my poor thinking. However, in the end, in my opinion, you are a group of beasts that slaughter civilians, women and babies. This is something that cannot be changed. Su Lu picked up the knife and fork and began to cut the beef on the plate. His trembling right hand that held the knife showed his current weakness. He lowered his head and asked, because of certain reasons, you temporarily did not kill me. I can understand. However, I still do not understand why you are willing to grant me such enjoyment. The you in the intelligence report does appear to be somewhat stupid and absurd in certain matters. However, someone who can develop the MX mecha must have enough wisdom to understand certain facts. Huai Chaoshu gently wiped the corner of his mouth and indifferently said, as long as you do not work wholeheartedly for the Empire, then no matter what, no matter sooner or later, you will die in the end. At this point, this special young Imperial officer emphasized, but you only need to give me a satisfactory answer to 2 things. I can guarantee that you will die with great dignity. And I think that this answer should not harm the interests of your government. What is it? The first question. You are not Li Pifu's illegitimate child. How did you manage to cultivate Yada Jinqi? Huai Caoshi's eyes flashed with a trace of biting cold. Yada Jinqi? Sulu confirmed that this was the first time he had heard of this strange term. What was Yada? What was Jinqi? Was it a wonderful setting in one of Master Schiller's plays? However, it seemed that the scorching heat in his body was very similar to the setting in the master's plays. Huai Caoshi did not mind his silence and continued calmly. The second question. This time you pass through the space channel and ambush the Ghost Fleet. You are infinitely close to success. Could even be said that you have succeeded. I cannot understand. How did you manage to follow us in the Empire's star sector by controlling a light tri-winged warship? At this point he waved his hand. The subordinate who had been waiting in the distance hurriedly ran over and set up the relevant equipment by the table. With a light beeping sound, countless fine beams of light shot out from the equipment and gathered into dense light spots in the air, forming a three-dimensional star map of the Empire's border star sector. Even if you have the star map drawn by the Federation years ago in your hands, you can't do this alone. Huai Caoshi's slender finger drew on the imaginary three-dimensional star map in the air and pointed at the obvious sailing trajectory. Frowning, he said, "Your sailing route was too perfect. Even if I had thought more thoroughly, assuming that you had the authorization of the Bureau of Proclamation before the crazy revenge operation, with the remote support of the charter computer, it would not have been enough to complete such massive calculations. Besides, every time your tri-winged warship accelerated or hid, it just happened to avoid the detection range of the fleet. How did you do it?" He looked at Su Li's eyes and asked solemnly, "According to the intelligence, you don't know how to pilot a warship at all." Sulu was silent. The first question involved the uncle, who was known as the #1 traitor of the Federation, who knew what kind of relationship he had with the Imperium. Also, this story involved the loophole of the Federation's The Glory of the Charter and his last hope of survival. Naturally, it was impossible for him to tell the other party. As for the second question, it was related to his greatest secret, so it was even more impossible for him to tell. Therefore, he could only remain silent. Huai Caoshi raised his extremely ordinary face and said indifferently, "I won't ask you to reveal the Federation's newest technological secrets. I just need a general answer." A moment later Sulu replied, "I can't tell you anything. I can only say that this revenge plan that seems impulsive is actually not impulsive at all. It's just that I didn't expect you to be on that flagship. If I hadn't met you, I would have successfully returned to the Federation by now." Still not getting an answer, Huai Caoshi narrowed his eyes, and a dangerous aura gradually enveloped the dining table. "There's good news. The Imperium has already successfully developed a high-power dedicated signal output device. In the last experiment, it has already successfully connected to your civilian network." Huai Caoshi looked at Sulu with narrowed eyes and said slowly, "The video that humiliates the Federation's war hero will probably be the first document we send over." Su Li's right hand that was holding the knife suddenly tightened. He knew that the humiliation the other was talking about was definitely a humiliation that ordinary people would find difficult to endure. What truly made him nervous was the Empire's following arrangements. He wasn't a narcissistic person, but he had to admit that he was now important enough to be able to affect even more people and matters, and on a much larger scale. The Federation government had spent a huge amount of money to film and broadcast the documentary Team 7. Together with the media that covered everything, it was only then that he and his troops were molded into a brand new military idol. If that video that hadn't appeared yet was widely spread through the civilian network, it would undoubtedly be a heavy blow to the Federation's public and the military's morale. If such a situation really did occur, the Federation government would definitely hope that this Federation hero would simply die in battle rather than be captured and humiliated by the Empire's people. Sulu also thought the same. "This is very interesting. It's just like playing cards. We killed Zhong Suihu, which is a trump card. You chased after us and killed Keaton, which can be considered as returning a hard card. Then, I captured you, the successor of the war god. I'm very curious as to what kind of trump card the Federation can return." Huai Caoshi's tone didn't contain any deliberate mockery. He raised an exquisite silver fork and sent a piece of tender beef into his mouth, slowly chewing. "Why isn't it a live broadcast of me being killed? Letting the entire universe watch you die. Other than stimulating the Federation's desire to fight and calming your internal conflicts, what good does it do for the Empire? I can let myself die, Sulu said with a serious tone. The department I'm in has a lot of drugs that can be used. Huai Chaoshi frowned, picked up an exquisite white porcelain salt jar, and lightly sprinkled some salt on the steak. Also, I understand people like you very well. You are not afraid of death, but before death truly arrives, you will stubbornly want to live on. You have strong confidence that you can live on. Therefore, unless you are certain that you will definitely die, you will never commit suicide. Sulu blinked, feeling that his eyes were a bit dry. Only now did he realize that this seemingly ordinary young officer of the Empire in front of him not only had inexplicably powerful combat strength, but also had an extremely strong ability to read people's minds and to coerce them with force. The dining table was silent. Only the sound of the silver knife and fork lightly touching the porcelain plate, and the juicy and tender sirloin touching the tongue and teeth could be heard. Huai Chaoshi was waiting for Sulu to make a decision and give an answer. Sulu knew that he wouldn't give any answer. He was like he was in a bottomless dry well, looking at the trace of light that perhaps didn't exist. He was unwilling to fall into eternal darkness, but he couldn't find any solution. Right at this time, an Empire officer walked into the dining room with a serious expression, holding an electronic spectrum record book in his hand. Huai Chaoshi narrowed his eyes and looked up. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked up. Chapter 592. Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes and looked up. Sulu looked up and narrowed his eyes. During the past few days of sightseeing, the Imperial soldiers who appeared in the open with the two of them were all wearing plain clothes. This was the first time he had seen someone wearing a military uniform, and he immediately thought that this officer should be a member of the security department hidden in the dark. Sir, there is indeed a problem with the intelligence feedback received last night. The Imperial officer stood beside Huai Chaoshi and reported respectfully and concisely, "We have increased the surveillance. Just now, the electrical detection room detected a low-energy waveform curve. It seems to be a civil electrical appliance, but the curve is a bit strange, and the spectrum exclusion is unable to obtain a result." Huai Chaoshi frowned slightly, and took the spectrum analysis electronic manual. Looking at the quivering curve on the top, she asked, "Weapon? Military and civil mecha heat start has been excluded, and the reference frequency of long-range weapons is also different. Analysis is being conducted. It should be safe, but the location of this restaurant is too exposed, so please leave immediately," the Imperial officer said directly, and he had no intention of avoiding Sulu at all. Although he, like many of his colleagues, did not understand why the Honorable Sir would bring this lowly Federation captive with her. In their eyes, this person was already a dead man, and it did not matter even if they heard some confidential information. Huai Chaoshi looked at the curve on the electronic manual, and the angle of her thin and black eyebrows furrowed a little wider. She was a little self-deprecating in doubt. Was there anyone in the Empire who dared to harm her? Sulu heard the Imperial officer's conversation, but his pair of black eyebrows did not helplessly furrow into a ball, but suddenly raised like a knife because he saw a very familiar curve in the corner of his eyes. His pupils suddenly constricted and brightened. He felt a chill coming from his neck, causing the hair on that area to stand on end. This was indeed not the heat start waveform curve of a mecha, nor was it the warm-up curve of a fighter jet. In fact, the entire surveillance department of the Empire should not have seen this curve, and there were very few people in the Federation who had seen this curve. But he had seen it before. In the glacier of 5460, Shi Qinghai, he and Gu Shifeng had discussed many times what electronic means should be used to destroy this terrifying weapon's only flaw that not many people had discovered. But because of the tight time, he and Gu Shifeng only found a direction, but did not succeed in putting it into practice. It was SCW. This curve was the redundant overflow waveform created by the activation of the ACW electric pulse ignition device and the magnetic resonance auxiliary effect. It sounded ridiculous that a gun could actually alarm an electronic monitoring device, but when it was placed on this big gun that gathered the wisdom of countless weapons experts in the Federation, and was so expensive that the former Minister of Defense cursed for 3 days straight, it seemed reasonable. When this terrifyingly powerful king of single guns first appeared on the Cholin slope outside the S2 Foundation building, It blasted apart Macklin's well-trained subordinates and powerful Special Task Force agents. When it reappeared in the snowy world at the front lines of the West Woods, it was like a ghost that took the lives of more than a dozen high-ranking Imperial officers in succession. In the entire Federation, only 3 ACWs had ever been produced, and one of them had always been in the hands of his best friend, Shi Qinghai. Therefore, he knew better than anyone else just how terrifying this great gun was. Due to the scarcity of manufacturing costs and materials, on the battlefield, the ACW was an extremely poor sniper rifle. However, if it was used for assassination, it was definitely the most despairing choice. There was a slight breeze of fresh air in the restaurant on the top floor, but the little goosebumps on the back of Su Li's neck were about to freeze. Where was that sniper? The ring-shaped restaurant surrounded by transparent glass was empty, and there was only a mountain ridge in the distance that looked like a black line. He should be there. Who was the sniper's target? Him. But if the Imperial people wanted to kill him now, it would be too easy. Why would they go through so much trouble? And it was obvious that the young and noble Imperial officer across the table did not know about this matter, let alone that there would be 3 high-speed tungsten alloy bullets flying towards him. Could it be that the sniper's target was the other party? In certain dangerous moments, the speed of human thought could even appear faster than the speed of light. In a very short period of time, Sulu thought and analyzed many things, but he still did not have time to judge the situation clearly, and he also knew that there was no time to continue thinking. No matter who the sniper's target was, the only thing he had to do now was to fall down as fast as he could and look for something hard enough to cover his body. With a whoosh, the silver knife, fork, and white bone porcelain tableware splashed everywhere with Su Li's movements. He was not a saint, and he did not care about the life or death of the Imperial officer across the table, so naturally he would not stupidly jump over to the other party. He just fell down resolutely and fiercely, as if he was heavily shot down by someone. His body was almost close to the ground. The silver knife, fork, and white bone porcelain tableware had just jumped off the beautiful stone table, twisting their bodies in the air. How could the supposedly hardest carved stone tabletop in front of him block it? The next second, Sulu was slightly relieved. This was because the Empire soldiers in the restaurant reacted extremely quickly. The ring-shaped glass adjusted the angle of light refraction in the shortest amount of time possible. Although this definitely couldn't block the sniper's bullet, it could make it a little more difficult for the opponent to shoot. Immediately after, even more Empire soldiers flooded into the spacious restaurant. These soldiers seemed to not be able to see the mournful lines of bullets. They carried the pop-up alloy shields and bravely charged towards the corner of the wall. 4 or 5 Empire soldiers fell on the road, but in the end they still managed to successfully construct a simple shielding corner. Sulu didn't expect those Empire soldiers to provide him with the same treatment. In fact, he thought that this was a good opportunity for him. Under the cover of the smoke and dust, he half lay on the ground, using his heels to rub against the mess on the ground, quietly and slowly moving backwards. Oxoxoxox. Right at this moment, in the corner surrounded by the Empire soldiers' alloy shields, a loud Empire language suddenly rang out. At this moment, this voice still sounded extremely calm and powerful. It was actually not drowned out by the whistling sound of bullets tearing through the air. Sulu could understand some of the Empire language. At the very least, he could accurately understand this sentence. Keep an eye on that Federation person. He stopped his slow retreat, frowned, and cursed fiercely in his heart. He didn't expect that in such a tense moment, that person still hadn't forgotten about him. That sniper actually didn't kill this person who was clearly the strongest enemy of the Federation. This made him feel a little regretful. The gunshots suddenly stopped. In the silence, there was a sudden vibration. The floor-to-ceiling windows that were already shattered beyond repair began to buzz. Sulu, who was hiding behind the table and covered in dust, and Hui Chaosher, who was anxiously surrounded by his subordinates and half covered in blood, couldn't see each other, but they did the same action at the same time. They narrowed their eyes, raised their heads, and cursed in a low voice, "Fuck!" There was a wisp of cloud outside the building. A dark green Empire fighter suddenly broke through the cloud and rushed over at high speed. What was even more terrifying was that the missiles under the wings of the fighter had already been detached and were spitting flames high in the sky. Chapter 593. Did he always see something inauspicious every time he raised his head and narrowed his eyes? Su Li's eyes were wide open as he stared at the rapidly approaching aircraft in the air outside the building, as well as the 4 dazzling missile jet streams that filled his nose with the smell of death. In the Federation's understanding, the imperial family should be a supreme existence in their star field, an existence that no one dared to look down upon. But how could there be someone who dared to assassinate that young imperial officer? They even sent out fighter jets. Death was about to arrive in an instant, but Su Lu was still unwilling to give up. He hurriedly breathed in the air mixed with smoke and dust as he ran a few steps toward the corner of the building. The beam structure of the building there should be able to increase the chances of survival after the building collapsed. Even if it only increased the chances of survival from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 1,000, the chances were still higher. Whoosh! 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 Countless densely packed sounds rang out as hundreds of white streams of air rose from below the high-rise building where the restaurant was located. They quickly swept past the ring-shaped glass window and then abruptly turned, heading toward the 4 missiles. The Imperial Defensive Bomb Cluster Formation? Right before the explosion, Su Lu recognized these things. In a flash, a thought appeared in his mind. To have the qualifications to have these battlefield weapons protect the team, the identity of the young officer should not be far from what he had guessed. The rapidly rising dense bomb cluster successfully intercepted 3 extremely powerful missiles in the shortest amount of time, but missed the last one. The violent explosion, the dazzling flames, the flying debris, and the pungent smoke instantly occupied the entire restaurant. A huge hole was blown in the wall in front of the right. The wind from the outside whistled in and was licked by the burning flames. The temperature was boiling hot. The slender and elegant high-rise building shook like a young girl who had been slapped on the back of her head by a naughty boy. However, for the people inside the building, it was like they had experienced a terrifying earthquake. The floor shook violently, and no one could stand still and fell heavily to the ground. As for the soldiers of the Imperium who were close to the center of the explosion, many of them were blown out of the building by the airwaves before they could even make a sound, turning into black spots that rapidly fell from the sky. Some of them crashed into the wall on the opposite side and died while spraying blood. Some of the soldiers were set ablaze, screaming miserably before they fell to the ground and twitched, unable to get up again. Su Lu was very lucky. The missile that wasn't intercepted exploded very far away from his body. Other than the rubble that flew up from his brow bone, his body was unscathed. In the corner a few steps away from him, Huai Chaoshi, who was surrounded by the soldiers of the Imperium and their alloy shields like a cocoon, was naturally not dead either. The soldiers in the corner quickly dispersed. Huai Chaoshi stood up with a cold face. Half of his body was dyed red with blood. Combined with the ruthlessness that flashed across his cold face, it made people shudder. In the blink of an eye, the emotions on his face suddenly became abnormally heavy. It was unknown what he had thought of, but this young expert of the Imperium who had remained calm in the face of an assassination attempt, only angry and not frightened, also felt somewhat bewildered and at a loss. However, these emotions were only temporary. Huai Chaoshi coldly glanced at Su Lu who was not far away, walked over with large strides, grabbed him by the back of the neck, lifted him up, and threw him to a subordinate officer behind him. Then he quickly left with the crowd. They shouted loudly, blowing down the giant electronic signboards on both sides of the street, blocking the center of the street as a fortification to stop the enemy's mechanized vehicles. At the same time, they drove over the military vehicles that they had decided to leave behind, also blocking the street. Even though they knew that this was a mission to stop the enemy, these Imperium soldiers didn't hesitate in the slightest. Their faces didn't show any fear, instead full of valiant fighting spirit. In order to protect the Imperium's pride, their most respected officer, they truly did not fear death. Huai Chaoshi nodded at his subordinates, turned around, and sat on the military vehicle. During this entire process his face was still cold, not saying a single word. As a soldier at this very moment, any sadness of parting was a waste of emotion and hypocrisy. Accompanied by the ear-piercing grinding sound of wheels, several military vehicles quickly drove away. Su Lu looked at the young military officer in the front row, who could make countless Imperium soldiers willingly give up their lives. His brows furrowed slightly and he coughed twice. He didn't understand where this person's grave and worried expression came from. This freakish expert who didn't even frown when half of his body was covered in blood. What was he worried about at this time? It shouldn't be that he was worried about the pursuit from behind or the lives of his subordinates. People like him should have long since become indifferent to such things. Suddenly, concentrated gunfire and explosions rang out in the streets behind them. Sulu turned back to look, only to see flames and smoke rising into the sky. In order to cover for Huaitsauscher's departure, the Imperium soldiers engaged in fierce and even bloody battles with the enemy in the streets of Mulberry province. Over 100 soldiers gradually died in silence. Of the several military vehicles that drove away, only 2 were left behind to carry out a desperate suicide attack. Huaitsauscher's group finally managed to temporarily shake off the pursuit of the enemy and arrived at the outskirts of a quiet residential area. The door to the underground garage slowly opened, and 3 military vehicles filed in. As the door closed once more, no one was able to discover the abnormality of this place. In the dim underground garage, Huaitsauscher's expression was still heavy. He looked at the electronic map and said, "Cut off all contact with the outside world and stay here for 20 minutes to observe the situation." "Yes, sir," a soldier replied. "This is the latest meeting point set up by the Bureau. As long as those traitors are unable to infiltrate the royal palace, they should not be able to find this place." They had some guesses as to who dared to carry out the assassination, but no matter who it was, if they dared to assassinate the emperor, then they were without a doubt traitors. Huaichaosher made a sound of agreement. For him, the most important reason for choosing this meeting point was not because it was hidden, but because it was the source of his confidence in moving unhindered through the universe. The history of the empire was written with blood. He knew this very well since he was young. However, ever since the emperor inherited the throne, the empire and the noble class were unprecedentedly united. At least it was on the surface. No one dared to challenge the dignity of the royal family, much less carry out such a crazy action. Who dared to assassinate him? Huaitsauscher's expression was unusually heavy. Just as Sulu had analyzed, he was not worried about his own safety. Instead, he thought that if those people dared to assassinate him, they would definitely know how angry the emperor would be. Then would the emperor's safety also be threatened at this moment? Suddenly the alarm rang. The Empire officer looked at the data feedback on the screen with a face full of shock. He said with extreme guilt, "The whistle left outside confirmed that the rebel army suddenly changed direction and is coming this way. Sir, this place should be exposed." As he spoke, the Empire officer's hand was on the gun at his waist. He swept his cold gaze over the people present, trying to find the traitor hiding among his own people. "Don't move." An officer at the front right suddenly took out a metal gun from behind him and shouted at the crowd, "Otherwise, I will immediately kill the emperor." The cold gun barrel trembled slightly as it aimed at Huaichaosher. The officer's voice was also trembling. It was obvious how much pressure he was under at this moment. "Rossi, you traitor, put down the gun. Otherwise I will kill you." The Empire officer from before roared angrily. He wanted to rush forward and use his chest to block the muzzle of the gun, but because he was afraid that the opponent's bullet would hurt the emperor, he did not dare to move. "Our people will be here soon." The Empire officer named Rossi laughed somewhat crazily and said in a shrill voice, "When the time comes, I will kill all of you." "Rossi, why is this? Have you forgotten the kindness that the emperor has shown you?" Huaichaosher looked at this subordinate officer expressionlessly. He could no longer remember when this officer had entered the bureau to work, and when he had become his direct subordinate. He did not listen to the angry questioning of his loyal subordinate. He did not even look at the trembling gun barrel. Instead, he took a step forward without any warning. Half of his body was covered in blood. It was as if he was stepping on the wind. In an instant he moved forward 2 meters. He slapped down with his palm, bending the gun barrel and breaking the traitor's neck at the same time. With a crack, the traitor fell to the ground. His head was horribly tilted to the back. Sulu, who was standing behind the crowd, narrowed his eyes. He was shocked. The emperor was seriously injured, but he was still so strong. Chapter 594. The Dark Underground Parking Lot, the Dangerous Guns and the Escape. This kind of familiar environment made Sulu feel a little uncomfortable. The internal strife of the Empire had nothing to do with him, a soldier of the Federation. Ever since he entered the underground parking lot, he had been standing silently at the back, watching everything unfold, trying his best to listen to the Empire's language, which was difficult to understand. Assassination, traitor. He felt that the conversation of these Empire people was very much like a clumsy script, but he had never thought that such a clumsy script would have such a seemingly natural, understated, and yet extremely sharp ending. The Empire soldiers looked at the traitor officer lying in a pool of blood with disdain, walked to the side of the underground parking lot, pulled open the cement wall camouflage outside, and then tore off a large piece of blue electronic dust-proof cloth. With a whoosh, a new Empire mecha in black and green revealed its true appearance amidst the flying dust. Its armor glowed with a faint metallic luster, its body slender like a demon, and strange metal boxes hung from each of its joints. Sulu narrowed his eyes, his pupils constricting. This was the peach miasma that had brought him to a dead end. Hui Chaoshu coughed twice and silently boarded the mecha, while the rest of the Empire soldiers quickly dispersed. All the lights in the underground parking lot suddenly went out, and in the darkness the low and powerful sound of multiple engines suddenly rang out, cutting through the silence and stifling atmosphere. Just before the rebel army surrounded the street, the peach miasma mecha broke through the door at high speed, turning into a ghostly shadow under the light of day. It crushed the cement road, knocked away the tanks in its path, and roared as it ran away. Its speed was swift, and its momentum was heroic. It did not look like it was fleeing at all, but leaving proudly. And then it threw itself into the sea of mulberry trees, inside the dimly lit cockpit. Only the green sea of mulberry trees on the monitor screen could soothe the nervous nerves and somewhat dry eyes. Those tender twigs and leaves fluttering in the wind flashed past the screen at high speed, gradually becoming countless green lines. It was possible to infer just how astonishing the speed of the mecha was at this moment. Sulu slightly lowered his eyes, no longer looking at the picture of Shanghai on the light beam that lasted for almost half an hour. His eyes fell on the officer of the Imperium next to him cautiously. The person beside him had sustained significant injuries in the attack at the ring-shaped restaurant. Blood had dyed a large portion of his body red, but this person's expression did not change at all. He continued to operate his mecha steadily, skillfully, or even exquisitely, dodging at high speeds through the sea of mulberry trees, avoiding what seemed to be an increasing number of enemies. Could it be that the imperial family were all monsters with endless blood flowing through their bodies? This should be a nervous escape, but to Sulu, he thought of himself as an outsider, so he had enough calmness to observe everything that was happening. Especially this peach miasma mecha. This was the latest generation of mecha that the Empire had successfully developed. It walked the path of multi-joint microengine acceleration. It was different from the Federation's development of the new mecha, but it was very similar in essence. Sulu had not expected that in such a tense moment, this young imperial personage would actually bring him along. However, this just so happened to provide him with a rare opportunity to observe the Empire's new mecha up close. He used his eyes to observe all the devices in the cockpit of the mecha, doing his best to memorize everything he saw. Although this kind of sleep was often fatal, it was always hard to resist the instinctive choice. The wind was still blowing the branches of the mulberry trees, rustling them in a monotonous manner that induced sleep. Sulu remained motionless. He silently looked in that direction, counting the other's breathing rate. Only after counting for nearly an hour did he lower his gaze and slowly take off his shoes. Immediately afterward, he took off his dusty and blood-stained silk jacket, gently wetting it in the small hole under the tree and tying it around his neck. Then, he silently stood up and carefully took a step back. His bare feet stepped on the soft, wet grass without making any sound. Not even the insects in the grass were startled. He took a second step and once again approached the mulberry forest behind him, forcibly suppressing his heartbeat and controlling his breathing. Then came the third step. As long as he entered the sea of darkness behind him, who could catch him? However, at this moment, a silent vibration suddenly came from his shoulders, causing his footsteps to freeze in place. Lowering his head to look, The bracelets tied to the 2 bloody holes above his shoulder blades weakly lit up 3 times. After a moment of silence, Sulu inwardly sighed and lightly shook his head. Under the mulberry tree 10 some meters away, Huai Chaoshu slowly opened his eyes. His eyes were abnormally bright as he looked at Sulu and said in a hoarse voice, "I always thought you to be a smart person. Now, it seems that you have made a few mistakes in your judgment." His voice was suppressed to an extremely low level. The night birds resting in the forest were still in their sweet dreams, undisturbed. However, he knew that Sulu should have been able to clearly hear his words. "The enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend. Those people who want to kill me are probably also very willing to kill you." Huai Chaoshu said with an indifferent expression, "The Empire is covered in chip detection equipment. Do you really think you can escape?" Sulu was silent for a moment. Naturally, he would not explain his final card to his opponent. He walked back to his own mulberry tree and somewhat tiredly sat down as if he had done nothing. "In addition, this time I don't know if I can survive." Huai Chaoshu looked at him and said, "But before I die, I will definitely kill you first, so you had best pray that I can survive." In the process of escaping, the Peach Miasma Mecha braved the danger of being monitored by the enemy, and finally succeeded in contacting a certain intelligence source. However, Huai Chaoshu still had no way of fully grasping the current situation on planet Liban. Right now, he could only try to find a safe escape route as quickly as possible. The Imperial Mecha Squad conducting this pursuit clearly knew who their target was. Even those soldiers who had not dared to believe their ears at first were able to confirm this fact after more than 10 mecha had fallen tragically at the hands of the Peach Miasma Mecha. All of the Imperial soldiers were incomparably fearful of that Peach Miasma Mecha, or more accurately, the person inside the Peach Miasma Mecha. However, since they had chosen this path of rebellion from the very beginning, there was no turning back. Instead, because of the trembling fear in the depths of their hearts, they became even crazier. In the last few mecha encounters in the Mulberry Forest Sea, the rebel army's mecha had become crazier each time, more reckless than the last. They knew that defeat was certain, but they continued to surround the Peach Miasma Mecha like moths to a flame, attacking the Peach Miasma Mecha at all costs. It was as if even if they had to pay the price of destroying their mecha and losing their lives in exchange for the malfunction of one of the Peach Miasma Mecha's most important sensors, they felt that it was worth it. Watching silently from the sidelines, Sulu gradually understood the intentions of those rebel mecha. His face grew paler and paler, but he continued to operate the Peach Miasma Mecha like an emperor. The undefeatable Huai Chaoshu also understood the rebel army's intentions, but he had no way of changing this situation. The Peach Miasma Mecha moved as fast as lightning, unparalleled in its evasion and retreat. Its close combat spear was swift and fierce. Not a single rebel mecha could last more than 10 seconds against it. On a normal battlefield, this mecha battle would have undoubtedly ended with the Peach Miasma Mecha's victory. This was because it could move around like a shark, cruelly searching for opportunities to attack shoals of fish, and then retreating again. If this simple cycle continued, the rebel army's mecha horde would eventually be wiped out. However, in this mulberry forest, the Peach Miasma Mecha could not do this. This was because there was no supply base here, and there were no components and materials needed to repair the mecha. The rebel army's mecha horde chased relentlessly and relentlessly, all because they wanted to force the person they respected the most to never have time to rest. Their injuries and exhaustion would continuously eat away at that person's strength. At the same time, they also wanted to continuously wear down the Peach Miasma Mecha's body. In this primitive agricultural area, if the mecha could not be repaired, then it could only be nibbled to death by shoals of fish. During the process of their escape, Sulu had been diligently observing or studying the mecha controls of this empire elite. Even if tomorrow morning or the next moment, this innocent fish in the pond would be burned to death, he still devoted a great deal of energy to this task. This was because the other's level of mecha control was truly very high. From the perspective of someone at his level, he was able to experience much more, even gaining a certain sense of fierce beauty. What shocked him the most, or perhaps more accurately terrified him, was that even though they had been on the run for more than 10 days and nights, This Empire officer beside him had actually been able to maintain a valiant combat prowess, as well as a vigorous desire for battle that he could not comprehend. Although this person's cheeks were becoming thinner and thinner, the light in those small eyes had never once dimmed. However, just as the several mecha units in pursuit had hoped, the heavily injured and bone-deep exhausted Huai Chaoshu held on valiantly. Meanwhile, the Peach Miasma mecha could not withstand the increasing wear and tear of its components and metal fatigue, finally collapsing at some quiet dusk. In the blood-red twilight, the heavy and massive Peach Miasma mecha crashed to the ground, kicking up a cloud of dirt and dust. Fortunately, the dense mulberry trees around it blocked the dust from reaching into the air. Not too far away was a row of simple and crude village houses. Judging from the row of hydraulic gears behind the houses, this should be a mechanical mill used to process mulberry trees. This row of mills was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, glowing faintly with a bright red light. The emergency hydraulic valves activated, and the Peach Miasma mecha's cockpit opened up a little. The new model mecha lying diagonally on the ground now looked like a patient gasping for air, waiting for death. Huai Chaoshu and Sulu crawled out from the open cockpit. The two of them were covered in small wounds, looking rather haggard. However, from the silent expressions on their faces, not a trace of it could be seen. An hour ago, when Sulu had been considering whether or not to remind this person that the mecha's components had already passed the critical threshold, and that it could shut down at any moment, the central control computer of the Peach Miasma mecha had blared out a shrill alarm. Huai Chaoshu had silently operated the mecha to begin the fastest ambush they had made since their escape, all the way to this stretch of red mills. The rebel mecha should still be 20 kilometers away. Huai Chaoshu stood under the overturned mecha, narrowing his eyes slightly as he looked up at the setting sun on the horizon, silently calculating the time. Then he coughed twice and led Sulu towards the row of red mills. The two of them entered the red mill to get some water, but they found no trace of anyone. It seemed that the faction that had betrayed the imperial family had at least taken control of the Mulberry province. They had cleaned up this vast farming region of mulberry forests very thoroughly. After drinking, Huai Chaoshu walked to the west wall of the red mills and narrowed his eyes to look out. The red rose still had not been contacted. Right now, he only had sporadic feedback from the crows in the bureau. He had no idea how dangerous the current situation was, but there were more than 200 Imperial mecha chasing after him. It was easy to imagine that the situation on this planet was very bad. Would there really be a problem this time? Huai Chaoshu narrowed his eyes. He looked like an ordinary Imperial military officer, but in reality he was definitely not ordinary. He had never doubted himself in his life, but he had never experienced something like this. As long as he was in the mecha, he was an undefeatable god. However, at this moment, the Peach Miasma mecha had become a pile of alloy garbage outside the mill. In the entire sea of mulberry trees, there was no way to find the parts needed to repair it. What was waiting for him? Being killed by his own subjects in his own planetary sector? A self-deprecating smile appeared on Huai Chaoshu's face. He suddenly felt that the red setting sun on the horizon was fake. Otherwise, why would his body feel so cold? Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the flowing water in the tunnel below the mill. After a long silence, he suddenly asked, "What do you think?" At this time, there were only two people in the red mill, so the person he was asking this question was very clear. Sulu frowned and looked over, looking at the pale face of the Imperial Royal in the twilight. He did not expect that this seemingly ordinary but actually extremely arrogant person would ask for his opinion. Chapter 596. No opinion, Sulu replied in a low voice. This is an internal matter for you Empire people, and I am a member of the Federation. If you are referring to the method of escape, I believe you have seen my file. My level of tactical deduction has never been high. These two people in the red mill were both extremely cold and ruthless. For different reasons, they were used to silence. However, for some reason, Sulu became more talkative in front of this person. For a second, he thought of his own childhood. Back then, he had lived with his parents and sister. He seemed to have a lot to say. Even when he was an orphan, he still spoke a lot. Perhaps it was because he later met a nagging uncle that he became less and less talkative. Actually, I think the key question now is whether or not your emperor will survive this assassination attempt. Sulu woke up from his momentary daze. He looked at him and said, "If he dies, even if you escape this planet, you won't be able to survive." Huai Chaoshi frowned. She did not expect this Federation member to see the most fatal part of the situation so quickly. Sulu paused for a moment. He looked at the Empire officer and continued, "Your Highness, those people even dared to assassinate you. Naturally, they will kill your father first." Hearing the words "Your Highness," Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes. A glint flashed through her eyes. After a moment of silence, she still did not give any response. Sulu looked into her eyes and said, "Rumor has it that you passed Mecha level 6 at the age of 12. I have a proud friend who has you as his goal. After these days of escape, I can confirm that you are indeed the most talented and powerful pilot in the universe. So, I don't understand why you didn't choose to break out of the encirclement at the beginning of the attack. Instead, you chose to enter this mulberry sea." The proud friend he was referring to was Taiyun. This Federation's Shadow Prince had once said that there were only 5 people in the entire universe who were his goal. "I don't know the situation outside. Mulberry Sea is suitable for guerrilla warfare and escape." Huai Chaoshi replied expressionlessly, "I didn't expect that so many Imperial soldiers would dare to betray the Imperial family. First, they would use the ACW, which no one in the Empire knew about, to launch a long-range attack. Then, they would use a missile attack. Finally, they would use a mole. Finally, they would tear off the disguise and directly use the heavy armored forces to launch a frontal attack." Sulu knew the power struggle within the Empire, but in his opinion, this assassination plan was very reasonable. If he was not so familiar with the activation curve of the ACW, perhaps the pride of the Empire in front of him, the powerful princess, would have died under that terrible big gun. However, this kind of assassination arrangement also revealed some kind of information. The force that dared to betray the royal family obviously only wanted to solve the problem in the simplest and fastest way in the beginning. They didn't want to make too much of a commotion. It was only later that they were forced by the situation that the whole incident gradually escalated. From this, it seemed that the force that betrayed the royal family didn't completely control the situation on this planet. "You should contact a reliable subordinate on this planet," Sulu suggested. "I can't contact Red Rose. There are too few sources of information. I can't judge who is trustworthy." Huai Chaoshi glanced at the watch on her wrist and said, "The traders will need at most 3 hours to see through my last disguise and find this red mill. I hope you can provide some meaningful suggestions." Sulu lowered his head and coughed twice in pain. He squinted at the princess and couldn't help but shake his head. Why did the princess ask for help from him, a member of the Federation, and make it sound so natural? "I think the Empire's satellites should also have a micro-positioning system." He looked up at the blood-red sky outside the window and said, "The fact that the traders haven't been able to surround you means that they can't use the satellite positioning system. So it's very simple. Whoever has the authority of the satellite positioning system is your people." Huai Chaoshi said, "The authority of the satellite positioning system is in the hands of Governor Ku Baoning." After a pause, she continued coldly, "Even if you can contact this person, you can't escape without a mecha right now." Seeing this person's attitude, Sulu felt a little strange. The traders wanted to kill him, but why was this princess so cold and calm as if it had nothing to do with her? "I don't think it's impossible to escape without a mecha. You are one of the most powerful people I've ever seen." Sulu looked at her pale cheeks and suddenly said, "Of course, if you think I'm a burden, you can let me go. After all, I can't escape the Empire. I can only stay in this sea of mulberry trees." Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes. She was about to ask who this person was, but when she heard the last sentence she almost laughed coldly. She said, "Don't try to leave my side. Then maybe you can put that Jinchi in my body? Take it back. You should be able to judge that having a fighting force like me will be very helpful for your escape." "1. That's impossible." Huai Chaoshi looked at him coldly. 2. Your tactical deduction skills are really bad. In this kind of flat, non-man-made forest, facing more than 20 military-use mecha, no one can rely on their own physical strength to escape the encirclement. Just now, when you were staring blankly at the sunset, I checked this mechanical mill. After a moment of silence, Sulu suddenly said, "I found a lot of mechanical farming tools below. This should be the farm owner's warehouse. Farm owner, Hui Chaoshu corrected him expressionlessly. She frowned and asked coldly, and, I can fix the peach miasma for you, Sulu said, staring into her eyes. Hui Chaoshu looked back at him silently, as if she was looking at an idiot. I'm the designer of the MX mecha. I'm the Federation's most talented mechanic. No matter how good a mechanic is, it's impossible to use a bunch of farming tools to fix an intricate military-use mecha, replied Hui Chaoshu coldly, clearly not believing him. When the war god traveled thousands of miles to assassinate your grandfather, he had been using parts from your empire's mecha to repair himself. As far as I know, that M37 mecha also used a lot of civilian machine parts in the end. Sulu looked at her and said, I may not be as good as you in terms of mecha combat. Of course, I'm definitely not as good as Lord War God. But when it comes to mecha repair skills, the two of you combined won't be as good as me. Of course, with just these farming tools, it's impossible for your peach miasma to become invincible again, but it can at least make it output 30% of its original power and run again. Hearing the two words War God, Hui Chaoshu's gaze suddenly sharpened, but she was somewhat convinced by Su Li's words. However, she believed that this Federation member must have some ulterior motive for voluntarily displaying his strength at this time. What do you want? She asked directly. I want freedom, replied Sulu. Impossible. Hui Chaoshu's answer was extremely concise and powerful, like a long spear coldly cutting through a piece of metal, so firm that it made one's heart palpitate. Inside the red mill it was silent. The two of them both knew that their pursuers were getting closer and closer, that the footsteps of death were getting clearer and clearer, but neither was willing to be the first to back down. They only stared calmly into each other's eyes, engaging in a battle of mental wills. It was like two battleships flying at high speed in a narrow waterway, seeing that the explosion of death was about to arrive, but each gripped the rudder firmly, unwilling to back down. The water below the red mill flowed silently and quietly. Suddenly, a leaf clamped between a mechanical gear fell down, lightly hitting the water with a soft thud, breaking the silence. You give me the mecha, and I'll give you a dignified death, said Hui Chaoshu expressionlessly. Su Li's eyes narrowed. He knew that this was the princess' bottom line. If the other party was willing to keep her promise, then at the very least, he wouldn't have to worry that the Empire would use this method of humiliating him to strike a blow to the morale of the Federation's citizens, causing those friends he cared for and loved to grieve once more. He blinked lightly and said in a monotonous voice, I want the authority of the peach miasma. I want to see the internal blueprints. I want you to open them all to me. Repairing the mecha doesn't require full authority, said Hui Chaoshu coldly. I insist, said Sulu. Hui Chaoshu's eyes narrowed, her voice somewhat strange. You want to obtain the blueprints of the peach miasma, so that you can escape back to the Federation in the future? You're very confident, even a little arrogant. As long as you have that doglet-like chip behind your neck, you won't be able to escape. Sulu looked into her eyes and said, Whether or not I can escape is my business. I'll keep my eyes open and see just how you'll escape. Hui Chaoshu expressionlessly gave him the secret key to the highest authority of the peach miasma mecha. 3 hours later, 60 to 70 Imperial Moon Wolf mechas crushed the surrounding mulberry trees, crushed the tranquility, and crushed the shadow cast by the red mill on the water. With a roar, they charged in from 3 directions, tightly surrounding this row of houses. Unlike the crazy pursuit of the past dozen days and nights, today, these Imperial rebel mechas finally surrounded their revered highness. Chapter 597. In one of the most heavily guarded manors on the Liban star, the light from the broken lamps, which imitated the starlight of the night sky, refracted and fluctuated inside the spacious building like flowing water, making the exquisite jade carving on the black sandalwood table seem as if it was about to come alive. The jade carving was of a spring silkworm. Below the white curve was a thin piece of jade that resembled a mulberry leaf. In contrast, the jade silkworm's body was round and cute, completely without the disgusting feeling that ordinary insects gave people. The mulberry tree and silkworm had an important symbolic meaning to this planet, so when this manor was being renovated, The most famous sculptor of the empire chose it as the object to carve, which won the appreciation of the manor owner and all the nobles. A young noble wearing a black silk coat gently stroked Jade Silkworm's body. His slightly gloomy face suddenly twitched as he coldly said, "His Majesty is already old and muddle-headed, but the Empire and the royal family have no reason to pay the price for his old and muddle-headed behavior. For decades in the Zhuotian Star region, no one dared to criticize the high and mighty emperor like this. Those poor rebels on the remote planets may have angrily preached similar words in front of the fire, but their stinking heads had been piled on the ancient city wall, and their corpses were burned to ashes and thrown into the stinking puddles." After the young noble said this, he still appeared very calm. Looking at the night sky outside the manor, he raised his arm and said with a cold smile, "Look at this planet. The emperor actually allowed those lowly people to eat together with us in the same school. What is he trying to do? Did he forget the noble bloodline of the royal family, forget the oath of the nobles? And this time's hunting plan?" A cold smile appeared on his face. The 3 technological breakthroughs of the Empire that are most likely to change the situation of the universe were actually used by him to kill a commander of the Federation. Think about the Westwoods Expeditionary Force 2 years ago that was destroyed because of his reckless orders. What kind of crazy emperor would do such a crazy thing? The luxuriously dressed middle-aged man behind Jade Silkworm had been silent and did not answer these treasonous accusations. It was not until now that he raised his head and said with a frown, "The time travel hunting plan was drawn up by the military ministry. As for the destruction of the Westwoods Expeditionary Force, I don't know what His Majesty thinks." The middle-aged man was Kubowning, an important minister of the Empire's famous liberal faction. He was also the governor of Liban Star. Because of his ability and charming demeanor, this person had a very good reputation in the aristocratic circle. Moreover, he also had a strong appeal among the commoners of Liban Star. However, in these dozen or so days and nights, Governor Kubowning had already found it difficult to maintain his composure. With a heavy expression, he stared at the young noble in front of him and said, "Speaking of madness, His Majesty ignored the staunch opposition of the Council of Elders and your father and made you a duke at such a young age. Is this not madness? But the young duke was actually covered in explosives and trapped me in the governor's mansion. Isn't that crazy? If you were really so loyal to His Majesty when I expressed my intentions, you should have chosen to summon the troops to kill me, even if it meant dying together with me." A trace of mockery appeared on the young duke's face. "But you hesitated. For His Majesty and that powerful prince, hesitation means betrayal. If His Highness was allowed to live, do you think you would still be able to survive?" Governor Kubowning's expression became even darker. After a moment of silence he said, "I really can't believe this was your father's intention. How could His Highness betray His Majesty because of these things?" No, father's vigilance didn't last long. If it wasn't for the tragic death of County King Carlton, how could he have the courage to fight his brother? The young noble lowered his eyes slightly and said slowly, "I don't understand what you mean," Governor Kubowning said in a low voice. "How much did Uncle Carlton do for the Empire for His Majesty?" The young noble said with a trace of emotion. Back then the entire Empire's West Star Line was dyed red by his troops. For the stability of the Empire, he killed countless lowly people, but he only received the title of Butcher. Those people who hated him to the core, who would have thought that he was actually just a knife, but the knife has always been in His Majesty's hands. He turned around, stared into Governor Kubowning's eyes, and said coldly, "Right now, the most brutal and persistent untouchables in the Empire have all been killed by this blade. Our Emperor is carrying out interracial education on this planet and the Great Class Harmony movement. He wants to play the role of a benevolent and fair king in front of billions of untouchables. How can he allow this blade to continue appearing in front of people, and remind those untouchables how many of their family members the royal family has killed?" "What are you talking about?" Governor Kubowning stared at the young noble and said loudly, "County King Carlton sacrificed himself on the battlefield for the Empire. What does this have to do with His Majesty?" "Died on the battlefield?" The young noble's pupils slightly dilated, with a trace of crazy mockery. "With your intelligence, do you think you'll believe this? Or does His Majesty think that the intelligence of all nobles has dropped to this level?" A spaceship of the Federation, a member of the Federation, forced his way through the space channel, and then in the Empire Star region, faced with a powerful ghost fleet, he easily killed the commander of the fleet and blew up the flagship. Is this possible? Is that member of the Federation Li Pifu? The young noble widened his eyes and said coldly, "The most chilling thing is, Our Invincible Highness was on the flagship at that time. Who could kill Uncle Carlton in front of him?" Governor Kabowning was silent for a long time, and then said with a pale face, "You think this is all a scheme?" "Of course." The young noble's voice gradually calmed as he said coldly, "No one knows when the butcher's knife in His Majesty's hand will be swung again in order to please those lowly commoners and to create his image as a benevolent ruler. Who will die under his butcher's knife next?" Father, me, and many people in Tianjin understood everything. We didn't want to sit and wait for death, so we had to stand up and face the battle. Although the flagship exploded in the end and there weren't many videos left, there were many witnesses. The military also investigated and confirmed that there was no problem with County King Carlton's death. Governor Kabowning said with a frown, "With His Majesty's power, I'd believe it even if there were 4 million witnesses. As for Father's investigation, Her Highness controls the Intelligence Bureau, so she wouldn't let the military find anything." "You think Her Highness killed County King Carlton?" "Yes. Watch your words. Your speculation is baseless," Governor Kabowning said sternly. "I won't allow you to insult Her Highness' character like this. Burning like the sun, warming the entire empire, was Her Highness when she was young. She rarely appeared in front of people these years. Who knows what she's become? For a future empress, what kind of cruelty and viciousness wouldn't she do?" The young noble said coldly. Governor Kabowning took a few deep breaths to suppress the anger in his heart. He stared at the other and said, "What did you do to His Majesty?" The young noble didn't answer him. He stroked the smooth jade silkworm and stayed silent for a long time until a dark shadow appeared between his brows. He then raised his head proudly and said to himself, "Even if we can't do anything, as long as we kill the heir he appointed, I believe that the empire can go back to the right path in the future." At this moment, the watch on his wrist vibrated slightly. He lowered his head to look, and a strange smile appeared on his lips. He said calmly, "Governor, let me tell you a piece of good news. You don't have to worry about me torturing you to get the satellite authority anymore, because Our Highness has been surrounded." The Red Mill was not dark in the night. Instead, it was eye-catching. When Whitesaucher's expressionless face appeared at the window of the Red Mill, it was even more eye-catching. It attracted a slight noise from the surrounding mechas. At this time, there were dozens of Imperial Moon Wolf mechas surrounding the Red Mill. These mechas only needed a simple sweep of their cannons to turn this row of crude mills and her into red powder. No matter how powerful she was, she could only welcome death. However, these Imperial soldiers who dared to betray His Majesty maintained a temporary silence. Through the screens in their mechas, they looked in that direction with complicated emotions. Because the person who appeared at the window of the Red Mill was the idol of all the Imperial soldiers. When she was still a young girl, she had already received the adoration and love of countless subjects. Because she was Her Highness. "Na Song, who sent you? The military or your family? Your sickly father? Does he know that you participated in this treason?" Hui Chaosher looked at the imperial officer kneeling on one knee in front of the room and asked calmly. Although she had not recovered from her injuries, if she wanted to, she could still kill this person or take him hostage at any time before the rebel mechas attacked. However, this was meaningless. These rebel mechas dared to take the risk of having their entire family executed to participate in this assassination. Naturally, they had already placed life and death outside of their scope of consideration. A calm conversation, maintaining the demeanor of a royal highness, could temporarily alleviate the tense situation. However, she knew that as the noble officer in front of her said, if she did not surrender, the military mechas in front of the Red Mill would move. Whitesaucher's ears trembled slightly. She listened to the faint noise behind her that was covered by the sound of flowing water. She silently calculated the time, not knowing if she could delay until the Federation person completed his mission. "Your Highness, Father did not know. Please forgive our actions because we only want the Empire to return to the right path." The imperial noble officer named Na Song knelt on one knee and said loudly, "The Federation is already preparing to attack. We need a stronger leader. If your highness is willing to accept what has happened and forgive the nobles who were forced to participate in this matter, I am willing to be your personal soldier and accompany you to win this war." After saying this, Na Song felt much more relaxed. He took a deep breath. Just as he was about to continue persuading, his pupils suddenly shrank and he became nervous. The ground under his knee suddenly trembled slightly. Chapter 598. Truth? What truth? White Xiaoshu's eyes suddenly narrowed. Soon after, she said lightly, "There is no truth. The nobles only know how to show greedy eyes in the dark night. How can they hurt His Majesty the Emperor?" Na Song didn't hear Her Highness answer clearly. His rapidly narrowing pupils had been tightly grasped by the scene in front of him. In the beginning, he didn't know where the nervousness in his heart came from. It wasn't until the ground under his knees suddenly began to tremble slightly, and a faint buzzing sound came from the red mill shrouded in darkness that he finally understood what was happening at this moment. Impossible. After more than 10 days of crazy and reckless mecha pursuit, Her Highness Peach Miasma Mecha couldn't possibly hold on. There were no military bases in this vast mulberry sea, no factories, and not even an automated assembly line. Before they surrounded the red mill, his mecha unit had carefully monitored for a period of time and confirmed that Her Highness Mecha had lost all mobility. In fact, Her Highness' new mecha, which left a deep impression with countless metal boxes hanging from its joints, looked like a pile of metal trash. It had been lying quietly and helplessly on its side by the stream behind the red mill just now. It was like a pile of metal trash. Why did this pile of metal trash suddenly move? He was stunned in place, still in a kneeling position. He raised his head to look at the tall shadow in front of him. This shadow was as heavy as millions of tons of steel. His body suddenly stiffened. This was the last question the imperial officer Na Song asked before his life ended. In the middle of the night, in the red mill by the stream, the rebel army's mecha stared in shock at the terrifying mecha that looked like a demon. It woke up from its deathly stillness and returned from hell. It stood up at high speed with a loud roar and smashed through the shabby houses, causing dust and debris to fill the air. At this critical moment when the situation suddenly changed, there was a moment when time stopped. In this short period of time, in the dim cockpit of the Peach Miasma Mecha filled with the smell of inferior engine oil, Su Li's eyes were abnormally bright. His gaze pierced through the light screen in front of him and stared at the back of the figure in front of the crumbling red mill. That person's back was a little thin. She, who usually gave people a feeling of invincibility, appeared so small and weak under the heavy metal mecha's feet. As long as he gave the command, the Peach Miasma Mecha would raise its gigantic mechanical legs and stomp the opponent into meat paste. The Federation's most powerful and dangerous enemy had suddenly become an ant that could be easily stepped on, because of such an opportunity that was hard to replicate. This kind of temptation was hard to resist. The Peach Miasma Mecha had been repaired, and its power output was now at 37%. If he could kill this person in front of him in one blow, Sulu had a 60% chance of avoiding the encirclement of these traitors and driving the Peach Miasma into the dark night. However, the person he wanted to kill the most had his back facing the Peach Miasma Mecha, but his hands were behind his back the entire time. A remote control device was emitting a faint light between the pair of hands that didn't seem to be strong but rather delicate. With just a glance, Sulu suddenly felt the two bloody holes above his shoulder blades begin to hurt. It was as if his blood and bones would explode in the next moment, turning him into a miserable corpse. The other party hadn't pressed the remote control, but just the thought of it made him feel cold. Even though they were surrounded by danger, Sulu in the cockpit and Huai Chaoshu in the shadows of the mecha still managed to make a bet in such a short amount of time. They were betting on who was faster, and the chips were each other's lives. Su Li's bright eyes abruptly dimmed. Expressionlessly, he suppressed that impulse. His right hand quickly entered the mimicry command and opened the hatch of the Peach Miasma Mecha. The Federation's mecha horde had reacted quickly enough. By the time they noticed the abnormality, the Moon Wolf Mecha, which had been in a state of alert all this time, began to howl and pounce forward. At the same time, The long-range weapons on its mechanical arms were ready to fire. However, they were still faster than that mecha and that person. The Peach Miasma mecha burst out of the red mill, abruptly becoming a shadow. Hui Chaoshu stood expressionlessly in front of the window. The window frame gradually shattered, the walls crumbling. The scene around her seemed to accelerate in time, and then rapidly crumble. She coldly looked at Na Song, who still hadn't managed to retract his stunned expression. Her feet pushed off the ground, and in a dense gust of air, her body quickly flew backwards. After more than 10 days and nights of pursuit, the large patches of blood-stained silk clothing were severely damaged. As she flew backwards, it scattered in all directions, like the ancient robes of a god fluttering in the starlight. The hatch of the Peach Miasma mecha behind her had already opened. She was like a monarch returning to the throne that represented power. Returning to her seat, the howling and sharp sounds of gunfire rang out. The mulberry trees in 3 directions in front of the red mill were viciously cut down by the sharp shrapnel. The white stubble jutted out sharply, splinters flying in all directions. Suddenly, the rebel mecha horde were attacked, and the muffled sound of gunfire was deafening. It was only then that the rebel soldiers in the mecha realized that although they had done a lot of preparation work, they still had no way of getting access to the data of the ammunition ratio of His Highness's mecha. It was even possible that the data of the ammunition they had was fake data deliberately sent out by His Highness's intelligence department. Because of this fatal error in intelligence, the rebel mecha horde had never imagined that Her Highness Peach Miasma mecha would have such a shocking amount of ammunition. Instantly, a small opening appeared in the encirclement. Of course, the most fatal reason for this situation still puzzled them. This had nothing to do with intelligence. This Peach Miasma mecha had clearly been severely damaged and could not be activated. Why did it have to be activated again at the most critical moment? Amidst the flying shrapnel, there was the ear-piercing sound of the heavy mecha stomping through the ground at high speed. After the Peach Miasma mecha's sudden display of power, the rebel mecha, and even Sulu, who was in the Peach Miasma cockpit, all thought that Hui Chaoshu would choose to retreat quickly after this wave of fierce attacks. She would leap over the small stream behind the mill, and throw herself into the darkness that could hide everything. Thus, the 10 mecha flanking the rebel mecha horde rushed towards the small stream. They knew of Her Highness near-invincible mecha battle strength, and the terrifying mobility of the Peach Miasma mecha. If they didn't advance in advance, there was no way they could stop the other. However, contrary to everyone's expectations, Hui Chaoshu, who had quickly taken over control of the Peach Miasma mecha, valiantly chose an even more direct path. When the 2 flanking rebel mecha advanced towards the small stream at high speed, the Peach Miasma mecha charged straight ahead. The red mill collapsed to the ground. The walls were reduced to dust under the concentrated attack of bullets. Under the starlight, the dust on the walls actually looked a little like the miasma formed by the dew on pink peach blossoms. The Peach Miasma mecha whistled through the red miasma. The alloy body of the Peach Miasma mecha was wrapped in wisps of dust. With a speed that the naked eye could not see clearly, it coldly attacked the rebel mecha horde in front of it. With a hiss, a 5-meter-long multi-layered forged alloy gun was pulled out of its case. It spun at high speed in the mechanical arms, dancing with the starlight and red dust. It was like a giant and terrifying peach blossom. The Peach Miasma was poisonous. The peach blossom petals could not be blocked. Upon contact, one would die. The rebel mechs that were blocking the path of the Peach Miasma mech all fell to the ground in a flash of red, their mechs exploding. In the mulberry forest filled with the smell of burnt flesh, 6 Empire Moon Wolf mecha lay wretchedly on the ground. Their outer armor was damaged and curled up. Sparks flew in all directions. There were 2 mecha that had been knocked down that did not completely lose power. Their metal joints crackled, causing the mechanical arms to contract futilely, and even sorrowfully like patients on their deathbed. The night wind blew past. The red mill had already been reduced to ruins. The dust gradually settled. The Empire officer named Nason had been crushed to death by the falling wall. His eyes were wide open and unwilling to close. The Peach Miasma mecha had long disappeared without a trace. The cockpit of the Peach Miasma mecha was silent. The lights were dim and only the rising and falling of the mecha indicated that it was running at high speed. After breaking through the encirclement of the mecha swarm, Huai Chaoshu did not take revenge on Sulu for the trace of killing intent that had leaked out from the peach miasma mecha behind her. After a long period of silence, she suddenly said, "If you can repair the peach miasma mecha for me like you did today, even if it can only maintain 30% of its power output, I can still clear out all the rebel mecha in this sea of mulberry trees. Humans were the #1 machines." Hearing Huai Chaoshu's calm and confident judgment, Sulu suddenly remembered what the uncle had once said. This princess seemed to never feel tired. The strength in her body was inexhaustible. Her mind could always maintain a high level of concentration. She was like a cold machine, but she was still human. There is no such possibility. After coughing twice, he replied hoarsely, "You have to admit, your luck this time was too good. There just so happened to be enough parts in that storeroom, and the core components of the peach miasma mecha were not damaged. The miniature repair arm is also still functional. But even if you can find enough parts in this agricultural area, this kind of repair cannot be continued indefinitely. Using agricultural machinery to replace precision military mecha, even if it can be activated, as long as the mecha's engine is running, the severe wear and tear between the components will continue, and it will only worsen until the structure explodes." The cockpit once again fell silent. As a mecha combat genius, although Huai Chaoshu was far inferior to Sulu in the field of mecha repair, she must have done some research. She knew that Suli's judgment was correct. This person's repair skills were indeed shocking, but in the end, it could only be a temporary replacement and support for a period of time. After a long period of silence, she spoke again and asked coldly, "A few hours ago in the Red Mill, you once told me how Li Pifu assassinated my grandfather." Su Li's eyes narrowed. Looking at the side of her face, he said, "Back then, the war god traveled thousands of miles, hiding along the way, attacking the Empire's lone mecha. Then, he used these broken mecha parts to replace and repair them." "Can this method still be used now?" Huai Chaoshu asked. "They are all Empire mecha. It should be easier to use," Sulu replied with a smile. "Then let's do it this way," Huai Chaoshu said. "I will be responsible for hunting down those traitors' mecha. You will be responsible for repairing them." Chapter 599. A cold, powerful and greedy specter of a mecha was floating in the sea of mulberry trees. In order to encircle and annihilate the specter, the rebel army, which had already arrived outside the Liban planet's atmosphere, had sent a large number of mechas and heavy armored troops into the Sea of Green. While the Governor-General, who controlled the most powerful military on the planet's surface, had been forced to remain silent, the rebel army could sweep through the entire planet. However, in front of the Spectre mecha, in the sea of mulberry trees where day and night alternated, the mechas and heavy armored troops suddenly felt like they had changed from being hunters to being hunted. They were confused and panicked until their hearts were shaken, and they were secretly trembling in fear. Between dawn and dusk, the cold rainy night, and the scorching sun at noon, the mechas and heavy armored troops of the rebel army seemed to be under attack all the time. The mulberry leaves swayed in the wind, dispersing the shadows. A few cunning rabbits fled in panic among the weeds. The mechas that were carrying out reconnaissance missions or were alone were instantly destroyed by the Spectre mecha. Then they were miserably torn apart into wreckage. It looked like their internal organs had been devoured by primitive barbarians who believed in demons. The main army of the rebel army had approached the Spectre mecha many times, but the Spectre mecha had used some unknown method to silently disappear from its original spot, leaving behind only the monotonous sea of mulberry trees, which was so dull that it made one's eyes go numb. It made a rustling sound, as if it was mocking the futility of these people. More and more mechas of the rebel army were destroyed in the encirclement. Not a single mecha could escape or even withstand the sneak attack of the Spectre mecha for a few seconds. Once they encountered the Spectre mecha, they would die. This shadow, which was like a curse, shrouded the entire encirclement army. When they thought about the identity and legend of the person in the cockpit of the Spectre mecha, the rebels could not help but feel extremely tense. The mecha was called Peach Miasma, but its body was painted with the black hibiscus flower that represented the imperial family of the empire. It moved like a specter through the dense green mulberry forest. Most of the metal boxes hanging from the joints had been destroyed, and 70% of the original alloy armor had been destroyed. Instead, it had been replaced with armor that had been picked up from somewhere. There were still clear traces of the use of high-temperature cutting guns and welding guns on the armor plates. The outer armor, which looked like beggar's clothes, was sprayed with oil sputtering lines. Together with the damage marks left behind by the fierce battle, it looked like a painting of the Galaxy sect, which was famous for its ugliness and fury. The Peach Miasma mecha, which had never contributed anything in terms of aesthetics, now looked more like a walking pile of metal garbage than ever before. The internal components of the mecha had already been repaired countless times. Who knew how many parts had been swapped out? Those temporary replacement parts were helplessly wearing themselves down, letting out a sad, low grinding sound. The two slender mechanical legs, nearly 3 meters tall, were unable to ensure an absolutely precise dynamic balance because they had collected the spherical joints of two different mecha. Every time it moved forward at high speed, the Peach Miasma mecha would always tilt its body, like a walking pile of metal trash. Suddenly it looked a little like a poor crippled metal patient. To make this mech that looked like it would fall apart at any moment move, to the point where it was close to going on strike countless times, only to once again let out a low rumble, and even to the point where it could continue to fight for many days and nights in a row. To be able to do all this was naturally thanks to the mechanic jointly cultivated by the Federal Nutshell Company and Uncle Fengyu. The joys and sorrows of humans were not the same. The joys and sorrows of the people of the Federation and the people of the Empire were diametrically opposite. Fortunately, both sides had absolutely similar thinking patterns and the same baffling units of measurement and design concepts. Even the operation of the simple maintenance arm seemed to be the same. Even with Whitesaucher's translation, Sulu could not fully understand the technical parameters on the Imperial mecha's components. However, when his hands touched the cold handle of the maintenance arm and pressed the switch, he very quickly began to familiarize himself with all the machinery, or rather, everything related to metal, and he fixed it. He even used the limited components to modify a Rebel Army electronic mecha station that the Peach Miasma mecha had destroyed. Although he did not succeed in infiltrating the Rebel Army's command system, he greatly improved the Peach Miasma mecha's electronic shielding ability. In the instant he completed the modification, Sulu thought of that truly amazing electronics expert he had met. Thinking of Gu Shifeng's 10 plump fingers, he silently assessed that among the ranks of normal combat forces, the Empire's electronics technology level was far inferior to the Federation's. The Rebel Army encirclement and suppression forces in the Mulberry Tree Sea were shocked and even terrified by the fact that the Peach Miasma mecha was like a specter, as if it would never have any mechanical problems. No matter how many intense mecha battles it experienced, the next time it appeared, it would still be in perfect condition. Although this specter mecha seemed to be becoming more and more tattered, the combat strength it displayed did not decrease in the slightest. The Rebel Army could not understand how the other had done this. Even though the staff officers had deduced some things from the pieces of the Moonwolf mecha, they still found it hard to believe that there was someone in this universe who could complete this kind of repair work that required expensive and heavy equipment in this absolutely agricultural region. Moreover, the other party had completely used the parts of the Moonwolf mecha to repair it. The Rebel Army officers gradually developed a misconception that the highness they were currently encircling was not fighting alone. In this vast sea of mulberry trees, there seemed to be a large logistics base operating continuously, providing an unending stream of powerful support for the highness's specter mecha. However, this sea of mulberry trees had already been swept clean by the Rebel Army. Where could there possibly be a large logistics base? Whitesaucher had not made any comments regarding the level of mecha repair Sulu had displayed these past few days. That ordinary face of hers did not even reveal a trace of emotion, but deep down, she was already deeply shaken. She knew that this Federation man beside her was an extremely powerful soldier, even qualified to engage in a fair mecha battle with her. However, she did not care about any of this. Her valiant strength and self-confidence were enough to support her contempt for Sulu. However, seeing how the Peach Miasma mecha had actually managed to hold out for so many days under this seemingly ordinary pair of hands, she could not help but feel admiration. Amidst the admiration was a strong sense of wariness. Amidst the wariness was confusion. The same confusion as those rebel army officers. The Federation's mecha research was not that far ahead of the Empire's. The level of the industry determined the level of operation. Huai Chaoshu could not understand how this person had managed to develop such inconceivable mecha repair skills. Could it be that this kind of thing also required talent? Chapter 601. While Huai Chaoshu was secretly shocked by Su Li's mechanical skills, Su Li's heart was also filled with endless admiration and even fear for her. He had never seen such a person in his life. Other than focusing on mechanical repair work, Su Lu had always maintained a normal rest, because his weak body was constantly on the alert. However, Huai Chaoshu, who was in charge of operating the Peach Miasma mecha, not only had to escape the pursuit of the rebel forces, she also had to constantly launch sneak attacks on the enemy's mecha. She had no time to rest at all. During the many days of tense escape, Su Lu had never seen this highness be able to maintain a high level of concentration, even if she closed her eyes once. There was not even a trace of fatigue to be seen. The rebel forces outside Li Banstar's atmosphere, after taking control of the Red Rose, continuously released troops into the sea of mulberry trees. It was like an endless wave, constantly slapping against the black reef, each wave higher than the last, each wave stronger than the last. However, Huai Chaoshu, who did not have the slightest time to rest, controlled the Peach Miasma mecha to calmly and almost indifferently withstand all of these attacks. Humans are the first order of machines. Su Li's heart once again rang out with the uncle's words. The more time he spent with them, the more shocked he became. So there really was an existence like steel in this world. The tattered mecha moved at high speed through the dark forest. A young man and young woman in tattered clothes were silent in the dark cockpit. The roaring Peach Miasma broke through the heavy infantry barrier of the Xian Ma Hills. Under the torrential rain, the encirclement only left behind violent battle shadows. A certain Empire rebel army division that had urgently parachuted into the sea of mulberry trees was suddenly attacked by the Peach Miasma as soon as they arrived on the ground. The division commander died tragically in a decapitation plan, for the promise of dying with dignity, for the responsibility of the country. For some completely different reasons, Su Lu and Huai Chaoshu worked hand in hand. Day after day, they continued to escape and counterattack. Tense repairs and fierce battles became their entire lives. The nobles who had betrayed the imperial family could not have imagined, nor could the madly searching for Her Highness the Princess in the Mulberry Sea. In truth, no one could have imagined that once the two most extraordinary individuals of the younger generation of the Federation and the Empire joined hands, they would erupt with such astonishing battle strength and accomplish an almost inconceivable goal. In the wee hours of the morning, the Peach Miasma mecha, which had narrowly escaped the first aerial attack of the rebel army, welcomed a rare moment of temporary rest. The powerful highness, like a demon, did not need to rest, but the soldiers of the rebel army could not endure this kind of intense battle. The morning light was dim, unable to spread across the entire land. The fog around the stream greatly reduced visibility. The tattered Peach Miasma mech silently crouched on the rocky ground beside the stream. Su Lu crouched beside the stream and splashed a handful of stream water on his stubbled face. The cold stream water flowed down his tangled dirty hair, spreading from his neck to his naked upper body. It made his body tremble, and he felt much more awake. He could not help but smile happily. Looking back, Huai Chaoshu was silently looking at the electronic manual in her hands, the pen between her fingers moving incessantly. She should be conducting some kind of communication. The silk coat she wore had long been torn to shreds, and she had changed into a mecha combat uniform. It had not been washed for many days, and the sour smell seemed to be coming from it from afar. Paired with that face full of dust, she did not look like a noble princess at all. Through hunting the rebel army's mecha, they knew some of the situation on Li Ban planet. Especially after Su Lu successfully repaired the electronic mecha's equipment, Huai Chaoshu contacted even more of her loyal subordinates. She had a better understanding of the current situation and the inside story of this shocking assassination. The rebel fleet had already taken control of the outer space around Li Ban planet. Although they lacked long-range attacking battleships and were unable to control the situation on the entire planet, They had successfully cut off the connection between Tianjing and Liban planet. Now no one knew what exactly had happened on Tianjing planet, or whether the emperor, who was in that vast and magnificent palace complex, was still doing well. This was the first rebellion led by the nobles in the empire's 100 years of history. Compared to the rebellion of the commoners and slaves, the nobles' rebel army had more resources and more powerful military force. The situation on Liban planet was dangerous and strange. A few great lords had already successively surrendered to the rebel army, but the numerous mechanized divisions under the control of the governor's office, the most powerful army on the planet, had maintained a strange silence, as if they did not know what was happening on the planet, nor did they see the fleets showing off their prowess outside the atmosphere. Through the information sent by the Intelligence Bureau's subordinates, along with Su Li's previous analysis, Huai Chaoshu guessed the reason for the current situation. The governor's office should have been controlled by the rebel army, but Governor Ku Baoning did not surrender. The rebel army was worried that killing him would trigger a counterattack from the governor's office, so they left him alive. Probably only an idiot like Louis would do such a stupid thing. He succeeded in ambushing the governor's office, but now he's stuck in the mud. Huai Chaoshu thought expressionlessly. Then her eyebrows slightly furrowed as she thought of the key information sent by her subordinates. It was from these few pieces of information that she found out something that she did not understand after she was ambushed. Even though the empire's reforms in the past few years had harmed the interests of some of the great nobles, under the powerful pressure of her father, these nobles still dared to launch a rebellion so hastily? They actually think that I killed Duke Carleton. Huai Chaoshu subconsciously looked at the stream. That man from the Federation was currently bathing in the stream with his upper body naked, revealing a mouthful of neat white teeth, smiling somewhat irritatingly. If he knew that he killed Duke Carleton and caused such a huge disturbance in the Empire, would he still be so carefree and happy? No, he would be happier. Huai Chaoshu thought unhappily with her eyebrows furrowed. Su Lu felt her gaze and scratched his head in confusion. He walked out of the stream, his bare feet stepping on the hard stones, and walked in front of her. He calmly stood in front of Huai Chaoshu, not in a hurry to grab clothes to cover his naked upper body, because after that luxurious silk coat was turned into silk, there was not a single piece of clothing on him, and he also did not have the habit of taking off clothes from the dead rebel soldiers to wear. The more important reason was that Su Lu found it very difficult to see this princess in front of him as the opposite sex, so there was nothing unnatural about it. There was once a joke. A man resentfully asked a strong woman, "Why are you so unlike a woman?" That woman coldly replied, "Because you are too unlike men." In front of a strong woman like Huai Chaoshu, most men would probably have a hard time finding a clear sense of gender. The question you asked last time I can answer you now. Huai Chaoshu looked into his eyes and calmly said, "His Majesty is not dead." The information channels in the direction of Tianjing were sealed. The people on Liban Star had no idea what happened there, and she, who was in the sea of mulberry trees, had no information to confirm. However, it was precisely this suffocating silence that allowed her to confirm the emperor's safety. If the rebel army really succeeded in assassinating the ruler of Zhuotian Star region, how could it be so quiet? For you this should be good news. After a slight pause, Su Lu said, "But it won't be of much help to our escape. I have to warn you again. This peach miasma mecha won't be able to last much longer. There is already a problem with the central wiring of the multi-engine storage room. I am a mechanic, not a magician. Once this type of core component is damaged, apart from replacing it, there is no other way. The problem is that we don't have any large-scale equipment that can be disassembled. Even if we do, in the entire sea of mulberry trees, there is no trace of any new Wolfang mecha." He spread out his hands, stared into her eyes, and asked seriously, "How many more days do we have to flee in this damned sea of mulberry trees before your people can come to our rescue?" Huai Chaoshu was silent for a long time. She didn't directly answer this question, only saying the longer the better. Su Li's eyes narrowed, and he frowned. "You want to delay a little longer?" Huai Chaoshu smiled slightly. As long as the emperor wasn't dead, the rebel army wouldn't be able to completely control the situation. As long as the situation on Tianjing planet stabilized, the powerful royal fleet would be able to easily solve the problems on Liban planet like a knife cutting through paper. Huai Chaoshu had persevered in this treacherous sea of mulberry trees with extraordinary perseverance. Even though her subordinates had already prepared to help her escape 3 days ago, she still didn't leave. She was stalling for time. Only if she was alive and proved to the governor's office that she was still alive through battle would Governor Kubaoning continue to persevere. So that's how it is. Hearing Huai Caoshu's calm explanation, Sulu said, "If things really develop as you think, that Governor Kubaoning will definitely be killed by the crazy and desperate nobles. I think that Governor Kubaoning should have the self-awareness to sacrifice himself for the empire," Huai Caoshu said coldly. Sulu shook his head. He casually picked up a rock beside her and sat down. Using his hand to cover his mouth, he began to cough silently and painfully again. The desperate battle in the sea of mulberry trees came to an abrupt end on a sunny afternoon. The rebel army, whose hearts and minds were filled with excitement and fear, finally succeeded in forcing the ghost mecha to reveal itself. Under the encirclement of countless heavy weapons, the tattered peach miasma mecha was like a frightened metal statue, silently stopping in the middle of a farm. However, there was no one inside the peach miasma mecha. The spy from the Royal Intelligence Bureau who had infiltrated the rebel army, at the cost of his life, had successfully lured a small gap into the rebel army's encirclement. After receiving the latest information, Huai Caoshu resolutely abandoned the mecha she relied on to shock the universe and sweep through the wilderness. She and Sulu braved the great danger and followed the gap, following a secret path in the sea of mulberry trees to arrive at a silk processing factory in the southwest. Chapter 602. An official of the Imperial Royal Intelligence Agency, disguised as a foreign trader in a silk processing factory, or more accurately, a foreign trader in a silk processing factory who worked for the Imperial Royal Intelligence Agency, received 2 extremely skinny young men in tattered clothes at the sewers outside the walls of an unassuming silk processing factory. The merchant didn't dare to look directly at these 2 targets of his, nor did he dare to discuss them in his heart. He only dared to lower his head and respectfully lead them past the walls, arriving at a small, dark and remote room. Only then did he dare to raise his hand to wipe the sweat off his forehead. He then turned around and knelt down. In a trembling voice he said, "Your Highness, we have failed in our work, causing Your Highness to be in danger for so many days. We truly deserve to die." Huai Caoshu didn't recognize this merchant. She hadn't been in charge of the Imperial Royal Intelligence Agency for long, and hadn't even seen all of the officials in charge of the various prefectural planets, let alone this merchant, who was only an unassuming 4th-rank liaison officer on Liban's star. They hadn't been able to discover the plot of the nobles' betrayal in advance, and they hadn't been able to warn them in advance, causing Her Highness to be surrounded by the rebel army. This was the Imperial Royal Intelligence Agency's greatest humiliation, as well as its greatest fear. If Her Highness had really been harmed in this rebellion, the grief of His Majesty and the anger of the populace would probably cause thousands of officials to lose their jobs or even die. We'll investigate the responsibility later. What are the next arrangements? Huai Caoshu didn't give any warm words of encouragement to her subordinates in this tense moment. She said in an extremely cold voice, "Has there been any news from Tianjing Planet? The information channel should have already been opened." The merchant wiped the cold sweat off his forehead again. "But this subordinate's rank is too low, so I'm unable to access the information." Huai Caoshu clearly wasn't satisfied with this answer. The merchant continued respectfully, "The Liban branch office has drawn up 17 escape routes around the Mulberry Sea. All the preparations outside have already been made to receive Her Highness as she leaves. The problem now is how to withdraw from these routes." "Haven't the rebels been moved away?" Huai Caoshu asked with a frown. "All the factories in Mulberry Sea are under the control of the rebel army. Especially the commercial routes and air routes, the control is very strict. I used some methods to get into this place, but this basic silk workshop is still 7 kilometers away from the next meeting point." The merchant looked at her feet in fear and said, "Most of the rebel army's mobile troops have been sent away by the wrong information, but there is still a heavy infantry battalion on this 7-kilometer road." Sulu had been listening attentively to the conversation between Huai Caoshu and the Imperial Intelligence officer. He noticed that the officer's tongue was always curled when he spoke. It was somewhat pleasant to hear, but his trembling voice made him seem particularly fearful. His proficiency in the language of the Empire was rather mediocre, so it was not easy for him to understand the heavily accented sentences. Only then did he realize that he was still in danger. "What do we do next?" he asked. Huai Chaoshu replied calmly, "Of course we're going to break through. That's a heavy infantry battalion, and we don't have mechas." Sulu frowned and asked in unfamiliar imperial language, "Why don't we try other routes?" "Because we don't have time." Huai Chaoshu turned her head and looked at him indifferently. Sulu shrugged and did not express any more opinions. But when the merchant saw this scene, he was somewhat shocked. There was actually someone in this world who dared to use such a tone to speak to Her Highness? This person who spoke with a lisp, as if he had not spoken for many years. What was his background? Is this a level 4 stronghold? Huai Chaoshu no longer paid attention to Sulu and asked the merchant. The merchant lowered his head and replied, "Your Highness, this is a level 2 stronghold." "Very good." Huai Chaoshu raised her eyebrows and said in a clear voice, "Since this is a level 2 stronghold, then you should immediately prepare your firearms." The merchant and Sulu were both stunned at the same time. Looking at this person with a thin face, they both thought that she was really going to take a gun and rush into that heavy infantry battalion. "I want a lot of guns, big guns." Huai Chaoshu added that no matter how many guns a person had on his back, it was impossible for it to be as dense as a forest. But if she had 3 Gatling guns on her back, then the bullets would be more dense and violent than a rainstorm. The high-speed and sharp bullets were shot out from the rough barrels of the Gatling guns, accompanied by a pungent burnt smell and the strange smell of the cold system. The bullets tore the air above the grassy slope and formed countless terrifying rays, blasting the barracks in front of them into countless pieces of smoke and dust. With a pale face, Sulu followed the moving human-shaped barracks in front of him and quickly ran forward. Looking at this scene, he couldn't help but think of a prehistoric monster that kept spitting out flames, and it was a female. Huai Chaoshu was not very beautiful, but if she washed her cheeks clean, she could be considered delicate and pretty. She did not look like those terrifying prehistoric monsters at all. However, a skinny woman carrying 3 heavy Gatling guns and madly shooting while running, with clear muscle traces faintly visible on her arms under the military sleeves, such a terrifying woman could no longer be considered a woman, or even a human. "Motherfucker, what a monster!" Sulu subconsciously muttered, but his voice was immediately covered by the deafening gunshots. In the eyes of the Federal forces and the Empire soldiers who had fought with him before, he was without a doubt a monster. But now he realized that this princess was even more of a monster than he was. How could such a skinny body contain such terrifying power? The Empire's Gatling guns were as famous as the Federation's Darlin cannons. They were extremely heavy, and in addition to the huge amount of ammunition required to continuously fire, anyone could estimate the weight of the guns to be jaw-dropping. But Huai Chaoshu lifted them up as if they were light. Using her skinny body to carry a moving ammunition depot, she launched an attack at a heavy infantry barracks. "What did you say?" Huai Chaoshu's slender waist turned slightly, and the 3 Gatling guns on her back roared as they changed their angle, blasting the military vehicle 300 meters away into pieces, causing a small explosion. "I said I have muscles too," Sulu replied loudly with some anger. At this moment, he thought of Xiong Linquan, the Xiong Linquan who was as strong as an overlord, but could only carry 1 Darlin canna. The 3 heavy Terran heavy machine guns were thrown into the pond, creating a huge wave. The fishes in the pond fled in all directions in fear. When the hot gun barrels came into contact with the slightly cold pond water, a sizzling sound was heard, and a few puffs of white smoke rose. A few intelligence officers disguised as workers nervously removed the empty magazines from Huai Chaoshu's body, but they almost hit their own feet. After successfully breaking through, it should be said that they unreasonably destroyed the outermost line of defense of the rebel army in Mulberry Sea. Huai Chaoshu and Sulu followed the intelligence officers who had been waiting for a long time on a single-track freight train and arrived at the next rendezvous point as quickly as possible. They boarded a small interplanetary spaceship. Chapter 603. Beep, 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 beep. Along with the piercing sound of the alarm, a startling red symbol appeared on the screen beside the cabin door. It was similar to a bug animation, alerting the people in the spaceship that the surveillance system had discovered a chip behind the neck of a Federation member. The Imperial Intelligence Bureau officers disguised as silk smugglers reacted quickly. In a fraction of a second, they pulled out the guns at their waists, blocking Huai Chaoshi and Wang Zhong behind them. The black muzzles of the guns aimed in all directions, while the communication system on their wrists rang with the sounds of data analysis and tracking. A few seconds later, the officers put down the guns in their hands with extremely strange expressions. Looking at the small-eyed man behind the princess, they realized that the source of the alarm was actually this person. This person was actually a member of the Federation. The officers thought back to the time when the spaceship was leaving Banban Star, and countless questions arose in their hearts. Could it be that the rumor of the aristocratic rebellion was true? Turn down the sound of the alarm system. Huai Chaoshi frowned slightly. Taking a step forward, she said in a cold voice, "I don't want to hear these ear-piercing sounds on the way back to Tianjing." Sulu followed her forward, shrugging his shoulders at the strange expressions of the imperial officials on both sides of the cabin door, expressing his innocence. He was slightly disappointed that the princess did not order her subordinates to turn off the chip scanning system. This also proved that although the princess was known as the most ferocious person in the universe, she was still cautious and meticulous in her actions. With her hands behind her back, Huai Chaoshi stared coldly at her subordinates as they replaced the electrically controlled explosives on Su Li's shoulders. She was still unwilling to relax until her subordinates painstakingly found a set of heavy electrically shocked alloy shackles and placed them on Su Li's ankles. Only then did she truly relax and slowly straighten her body. Sulu watched as her eyes slowly narrowed, like a book with a black cover that was about to be closed. Suddenly, his eyebrows jumped and he said, "Don't fall." Huai Chaoshi suddenly opened her eyes and stared at him. "What did you say? Don't fall." Sulu acted as if he did not feel her sharp gaze and said firmly, "Don't forget what you promised me." What did he promise? A dignified death or a dignified life? Huai Chaoshi frowned slightly. After a moment, he thought of something and a rare gentle smile appeared on his lips. He pointed at Sulu on the chair with his right hand and said to the subordinates around him, "As long as he doesn't run away, treat him well." "Yes, Your Highness," the intelligence officer on the spaceship answered without hesitation. Hearing this, Sulu was truly relieved. His feet that were tightly bound by heavy shackles moved as if he was scratching an itch. Then, seeing Huai Chaoshi slowly narrowing her eyes again, he reminded the officials of the Imperium around him, "Hold her." The officials of the Empire did not know what this person from the Federation meant. More importantly, they had never imagined that Her Highness, who was standing by the porthole of the warship, would fall one day despite her slim figure and the feeling that she was invincible. Her Highness, who was about to become great because of her strength alone, would fall one day. That was why their reaction was a step slower. Huai Chaoshi's narrowed eyes finally closed gently. With the touch of her single eyelid, the eternally burning crystal engine furnace seemed to have been turned off. She still had her hands behind her back and proudly and calmly stuck out her chest. Maintaining this cool posture, she fell backwards. With a muffled bang, she fell head first onto the ground of the spaceship, making it tremble slightly. Cries of disbelief and angry shouts erupted from all around. The officials of the Imperial Intelligence Department rushed over as fast as they could. A moment later, they discovered with some lingering fear and some disbelief that Her Highness was not injured at all. She had just fallen asleep. The nervous officials escorted Her Highness to rest and hurriedly opened the healing pod. Meanwhile, the officials who stayed in the pod looked at Sulu with strange expressions. On the surface, they did not understand the true relationship between this Federation member and Her Highness. On the surface, they did not understand why this person could see that Her Highness was about to fall. Sulu lowered his head. His gaze followed the explosives on his shoulder and landed on the heavy alloy shackles. The corners of his lips curled into a smile. After fleeing and fighting for so many days in that sea of mulberry trees without a moment of rest, even a true metal body was probably about to collapse. After entering the spaceship, Huai Chaoshu confirmed that she was temporarily safe. Once her mind relaxed, the fatigue and injuries gushed out like a flood. How could she not fall? If she still did not fall, in front of such a terrifying enemy, Su Lu would really lose all hope. Fortunately, she fell in the end. The empire was a society with a strict hierarchy. The 5 classes of royalty, nobles, commoners, peasants, and slaves were divided quite clearly. In the vast space era, the empire was still able to maintain its imperial power. The empire's royalty relied on the oppression from the top to the bottom and the incomparably bloody strength to maintain order. The history of the empire was actually a history of suppression and resistance. The history of the empire gradually turned the peasants and slaves into a class, the most miserable class. In recent history, the most miserable class in the Empire's Star region had already become the Federation members. Although the number of Federation members who were captured and brought into the Empire was extremely small, this type of object that even the peasants and slaves could spit and throw eggs at on the streets could only compete with pigs and dogs for the treatment they enjoyed. The Federation members were the best targets for the peasants and slaves to vent their dissatisfaction. They were the supreme weapon that maintained the stability of the Empire's society, the bright light that guided the Empire forward. Thus, they naturally became the most unshakable part of the Empire's strict order. Anyone, regardless of whether they were the peasants struggling in the slums or the slaves with their backs to the sky in the mines, had already been nurtured an instinctive hatred for the Federation members, a fanatical bloodlust. Their existence was not necessarily reasonable, but they definitely had reasonable needs. If Su Lu had not snatched those words out of Huai Caoshu's mouth before she fell asleep, one could imagine how miserable his treatment on the disguised spaceship of the Intelligence Bureau would have been. Just like the 2 Imperial experts on the Red Rose, the officers of the Imperial Intelligence Bureau would not have minded slowly tormenting him as an experiment subject until there was not a single part of his body left unscathed, his organs and limbs torn apart, leaving only his last breath to swallow the past of the heroes of the Federation. Fortunately, at the top of the strict order of the Empire was the imperial authority that could not be challenged. Since the princess had spoken, even the lowliest Federation member would instantly become a guest that must be treated well. No matter how unwilling the officers of the Imperial Intelligence Bureau were, they had to do it, because the princess would wake up from her deep sleep one day. The disguised smuggler spaceship used some unknown method to break through the blockade of the star system by the rebel fleet. It traveled long and far in the dark and silent space, following the top-secret smuggling route shared by the Silk Smugglers and the Imperial Intelligence Bureau, getting further and further away from the turbulent planet. In these days, the standard meals in space, the delicious hand-ground coffee of the Empire, the language of the Empire became clearer and clearer, the novels of the Empire that were used to pass the time, and the sentences in the novels that were difficult to understand gradually became easier to understand. This was Su Li's life on the spaceship. If the heavy shackles on his ankles had not rubbed his skin to the point of bleeding, and if the explosives piercing through his shoulder blade had not been so painful, he would have been able to enjoy the journey. Other than that, he had been silently observing the actions of the officers of the Imperial Intelligence Bureau. He watched as the officers of the Imperial Intelligence Bureau dealt with the rebel fleet, talked to the smuggling bosses hidden in the darkness, and escorted Huai Caoshu away from danger seemingly dangerous, but actually casually. He could not help but feel more and more shocked. The Imperial Intelligence Bureau, an intelligence agency that was very similar to the Bureau of Proclamation but did not have a charter computer, displayed too much ability. The intelligence of countless spies was like the information feedback of the Federation's ubiquitous chips. If the Federation's the glory of the Charter relied on the powerful computing power of the central computer and the ubiquitous information nodes, then the Imperial Intelligence Bureau used to rule the universe relied on people everywhere, people like the sea, people like the mountains, people like the vast ocean, people like the mountains, people like the mountains, people like the vast ocean, people like the mountains. 11 days had passed in the Empire's Standard Time, and Su Lu was once again deeply shocked by the scene that appeared on the screen. Covering the sky and covering the sun was not enough to describe the fleet in space ahead. In fact, when this fleet of hundreds of Empire's battleships suddenly appeared in front of the interstellar passage, the entire universe seemed to be swallowed up by the densely packed fleet of battleships. The black hibiscus logo on the front of these battleships was so eye-catching that it made people shudder. The terrifying Empire's royal fleet finally left the space base outside of Tianjin planet. They brushed past the lone Imperial Intelligence Bureau's spaceship, leaving behind 10 battleships as protection, while the rest of the battleships all rushed towards Liban planet. A few days later, images of space around Liban planet appeared on the screen. Countless silent explosions and dazzling fireworks bloomed one after another in that area of space. Sulu narrowed his eyes as he watched all this. He realized that the Intelligence Bureau's officers beside him did not have any excited expressions. Perhaps in the eyes of these officers, who were extremely loyal to the imperial family, this aristocratic rebellion was a joke. As long as His Majesty and Her Highness were still alive, these reactionaries would be torn to pieces sooner or later. What are you thinking about? A voice sounded behind him. Sulu subconsciously opened his mouth. He spoke in the Empire's language, but he immediately realized that the person behind him was speaking in the Federation's language. On this spaceship, there was only one person who spoke to him in the Federation's language. He turned his head and looked at the ordinary face that no one dared to underestimate. He smiled and said, "You're awake." Yes. Huai Chaoshu carried a cup of coffee and walked to the side of the chair. She looked at the balls of flames on the screen and said, "It seems like there is something wrong with your mood. Liban planet is a sea of fire. I don't know how many people will die. Can that governor survive? I just received bad news. Governor Kubowning has already died for his country." After a moment of silence, Sulu said, "I thought of that officer who surrounded us in the sea of mulberry trees that day. Although I can't completely understand your conversation, I still feel pity for him. Your aristocrats seem to like posturing, but they don't understand that posturing can always easily lead to death." Huai Chaoshu put down the cup of coffee and said, "You don't understand? I really don't understand. For example, why did that Governor Kubowning, who clearly knew that he was going to die, persist for you and your imperial father? Your president is a puppet of vote politics, but over here, His Majesty is the Empire. This discussion ends here." Sulu was silent again. Suddenly he asked, "Can you explain to me the composition of the Empire's fleet that is going to quell this rebellion?" The two of them weren't the only ones in the room. Those officers of the Imperial Intelligence Bureau, who were quietly working, had actually been carefully listening to the conversation between Her Highness and that person from the Federation. Their profession meant that the Federation language was a compulsory subject, so they heard this conversation clearly. The first part of the conversation shocked them, that the high and mighty Her Highness would speak to that lowly Federation citizen in a tone of equality, but the last part really gave them the urge to immediately kill Sulu. The composition of the Empire's fleet, whether it was the crudest ratio of functional ships or the most subtle increase in firepower, was without a doubt top-secret information. Even the average aristocrat didn't have the qualifications to access this information, let alone ask a person from the Federation. The spaceship was silent. The officers of the Imperial Intelligence Bureau thought that Her Highness would perhaps fly into a thunderous rage, or perhaps unexpectedly not give any response. However, Huai Chaoshu's following response was already beyond their understanding. "This fleet is the Heavenly Thunder Fleet. It belongs to the First Royal Fleet. The flagship Songlei is powered by 21 sets of compound engines. Its armor is 3 layers of increasing thickness." Huai Chaoshu was silent for a moment before she began to calmly explain the Empire's military's absolute secret information. It was as if she had completely forgotten that Sulu in the chair was a soldier from the Federation. The entire spaceship's officers were dumbfounded. Apart from her voice, there was a deathly silence. Even a night cat walking past could hear the thunderous footsteps. Only Sulu noticed the flash of light in Huai Chaoshu's eyes. He was also the only one who understood why Huai Chaoshu dared to tell him these things. "What you're asking isn't anything important." Huai Chaoshu finished explaining the composition of the fleet and lowered her head to look at Sulu with a smile, her face full of confidence. "Are there really laser weapons in the outer space bases of Tianjin? We've been guessing this all this time." Sulu continued to ask without holding back. "You'll naturally find out when you have the ability to attack." Huai Chaoshu put her hands behind her back and said calmly, "However, I can give you a rough estimate of the firepower. According to the defensive capabilities of your fleet, they should be able to hold on for more than 17 seconds. What about the Wolfang mecha? Although the microengines in the 47 spherical joints can avoid the interference of the electronic turbulence in the containment chamber, how can they achieve synchronization? Translator. Atlas Studios Editor. Atlas Studios. The quiet smuggling spaceship headed towards Tianjing planet. The voices of two youths who appeared ordinary on the outside but were, in fact, prouder and more confident than anyone else, rang out in the quiet cabin. This conversation lasted for an unknown period of time. They talked about the Empire's military deployment, Tianjing planet's culture, the most famous food among the Empire's people, and the most direct answers to the most direct questions. Between the questions and answers, there was an atmosphere like that of a sword brewing. In the sea of mulberry trees, Sulu and Huai Chaosher had already discussed this. This was just pushing the discussion one step further. You say that you want to escape, but you're just asking for trouble. She knew that he would definitely want to escape. She knew that the moment he escaped, he would cause even greater harm to the Empire. However, she insisted on saying this because she firmly believed that he wouldn't be able to escape. On the contrary, the more he knew, the more he wanted to escape but couldn't. This was a very interesting gamble. Sulu, the man who was already hanging upside down on the gallows, had steel chips tied to his hair. With every sentence that Huai Chaosher said, the chips would increase until they were thousands of tons, tens of thousands, tens of millions of tons like seawater. Actually, you don't have to make this gamble with me. The royal battleships around the spaceship dispersed like ghosts, and a blurry nebula appeared in the distance. Sulu knew if that was their destination. After ending today's discussion and gaining a preliminary understanding of the Empire's literary history, he suddenly spoke to Huai Chaosher beside him. I never gamble. Huai Chaosher narrowed her eyes at the nebula that was only the size of a fingernail and said, since the start of the war, there have been a total of 27 Federation prisoners who pretended to surrender and then tried to escape. Among them, there were many who were much more cunning and powerful than you, but not a single one of them was able to escape more than 3 kilometers from the surface of the planet. Sulu was silent, knowing the reason she was talking about. Huai Chaosher coldly glanced at the back of Sulu's neck, a hint of disgust appearing in her eyes. She said mockingly, just like how we can't enter the Federation, you guys can't either. To have a machine implant a dog's tail in your body, I really don't know what you Federation people are thinking. Sulu laughed, not intensely arguing with the other over the issue of the chip. Instead he said, this isn't something I can choose or decide. I sympathize with you and all of you. Huai Chaosher frowned slightly and said, that's why I really don't understand why a guy like you can still laugh so happily as death draws closer and closer. I don't believe that you really have the confidence to escape. Of course. Her pair of straight eyebrows raised slightly, and she said with narrowed eyes, I'm looking forward to the surprises you can bring me. Could this be the so-called loneliness of the experts? Sulu scratched his head, his shoulder hurting a little, and his brows furrowed. Probably so, Huai Chaosher replied. In the magnificent interstellar era, the individual heroism supported by super strength had long since given way to the cold mechanical order. Under such a background, anyone who dared to express their feelings of invincibility to the princess by the porthole could most likely be classified as a lunatic or a pretentious idiot. However, history was so long, and the human population was so large, so there would always be peerless experts who had the qualifications to say such words. For example, Li Pifu, or the person who had his teeth smashed by Li Pifu. For example, him, her, and him. I'll do my best. Sulu looked into her eyes and replied with the most serious tone he had ever used in his life. The spaceship landed on a huge planet, and the bulletproof limousine led the group out of the secret royal military base. After driving for about 70 kilometers, they entered a heavily guarded manor. Sulu, who was wearing the helmet of darkness, could not see anything, and could not even hear anything. All of this was completely based on the inference in his mind. The acceleration of gravity during landing, the speed felt by his body, and the time silently counted in his mind, everything was just inference. Stepping on the protruding round stone road, Sulu was dragged forward by the dynasty's soldiers. He suddenly said, I still have a very important question to ask about that Ba Dao. He knew that Huai Chaoshi definitely had not left yet. If she wanted to leave, she would definitely say something to him. Sure enough, a moment later, he heard that person's cold and calm voice. I'll tell you before you die. Sulu smiled and did not say anything else. Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes and looked at the back of the figure that disappeared into the underground passage. For some reason, she felt a little strange in her heart, not because of this bet that she thought she would definitely win, but because of something else. On the way back to the core of the empire on the Wild Rose, she needed to know Su Li's secret at all costs. However, after receiving a complete analysis of the information, she immediately withdrew the idea of chopping off this person's arm. This was because she firmly believed that with this person's seemingly dull but actually firm temperament, once faced with such a situation, he would definitely choose to commit suicide without hesitation. At that time, she did not want him to die too early, die too quickly, but the current situation of the empire did not allow him to commit suicide. He could only commit suicide because the royal family still had to give a clear explanation and account to those neutral nobles. Sulu was no stranger to the dark and silent prison cell. He had once endured an entire half-year in such an environment where he would die in solitude. The Fox Fortress was once as intimate as his second home, but at that time he had the old thing playing. What could he have now? He could only constantly think, secretly experimenting, and gently stroking the metal bracelet on his left wrist. His life in the Black Prison did not last long. He welcomed the high-ranking judge of the empire's judicial organization and the merciless executioner. After seriously listening to the empire's sentence with a Tianjing accent, Sulu finally understood that he would be executed in public at the entrance of the palace tomorrow. He furrowed his itchy brows, scratched his itchy hair, and rubbed his itchy instep. The electronic devices on his shoulder blades and the heavy shackles on his ankles clanged, making him feel a little uneasy. Where is the dignity you promised? He looked at the darkness outside the Black Prison and asked very seriously. No torture, no death by 1,000 cuts, no humiliation, dying by a metal bullet. For a soldier, is this not dignity? Huai Chaoshi appeared at the entrance of the Black Prison and spoke coldly with her hands behind her back. I don't understand why you have to do such an unnecessary trial. However, my empire's words are correct. You seem to have said that I am Li Pifu's illegitimate son. Sulu stared at her, who was standing by the door. For people of the Federation, isn't it an honor to die with such an identity? Of course not. Sulu shook his head and said, I have a name, a father, a mother, a sister, a teacher, and friends. I don't have such a hobby. Huai Chaoshi was silent for a moment before saying, before the execution, I will tell you about Ba Dao. After saying this, she silently turned around and prepared to leave with her hands behind her back. It's a pity that I won't have the chance to hear the secret I want to know the most. Sulu looked at her back and grinned. His white teeth were as bright as his eyes at this moment. Huai Chaoshi's pupils constricted rapidly. Her body whistled through the air as she flew backwards. Her finger went straight for Su Li's chest. However, when the fingertip was still a few centimeters away from his chest, the smiling small-eyed man suddenly spat out a mouthful of black blood and then fell straight down. Chapter 604. If a person wanted to kill themselves, they could choose countless ways. The variety of choices far surpassed the Federation's protein meat. A straw rope, a fruit knife, or a golden chain were all enough to end a person's life. Even if one didn't have a straw rope, one could still pick up a rusty nail without a fruit knife, or a piece of metal without a golden chain. Moreover, this world was full of tall buildings, low buildings, deep pits, and shallow pits. The height and depth of the trees were enough to kill. Even if one's luck was so bad that they couldn't find anything at the moment of death, one would still have a tongue. Biting one's tongue to commit suicide might be too much of a grudge, but in the face of death, all methods were equal. Therefore, suicide was not a difficult matter. Huai Chaoshi was a dazzling red sun high up in the empire when she was young. After puberty, she hid her splendor and walked between the imperial palace and the military department. In recent years, she silently presided over the work of the Royal Intelligence Agency in secret. She had seen the surging waves and swallowed mountains and rivers, seen the filthy, vicious, and cruel darkness. As always, her heart was as strong as her body. For such a person, something as simple as suicide should not have caused her too much trouble. However, when she saw the scene of Sulu vomiting black blood and falling straight to the ground, her valiant heart could not help but palpitate a little, because the timing was wrong. After carefully studying all the information about Sulu, Huai Chaosher had never doubted that this person had the courage to kill her. However, why would he so resolutely choose to end her life before the last moment? You should still have many questions that need answers. Why are you willing to commit suicide? She looked at the Federation man surrounded by medical personnel and narrowed her eyes. Your Highness, the Imperial Medical Officer reported in a low voice, according to the results of the examination just now, his lung hematoma is very serious. His respiratory failure is severe. If he is needed alive, we must immediately send him to the ground for rescue. Then what are you hesitating for? Huai Chaosher frowned at the medical officer and said, what is needed on the execution ground is a living Federation war hero, not a corpse. But the problem now is that even if we are lucky enough to save this person, he won't be able to stand up again. The medic wiped the sweat on his forehead. His medical team was equipped with enough examination equipment, so he knew very well how serious the injuries of this Federation captive were, and how strange they were. The nerve bundles in his body are perfectly fine, and there is no problem with the nerve hub under the double fiber bond. But for some reason, his nerve connection seems to have lost its function, like it has been broken. We cannot find the problem, so there is no way to fix it. What's the best outcome? Huai Chaosher lowered her eyes and asked. Paralyzed, the medic replied in a low voice. Huai Chaosher was silent for a moment, then walked to the bedside. The busy Imperial military doctors hurriedly made way for her. Hearing the beeping sounds of the instruments, she slowly put her hands behind her back. Looking at the dying Sulu, her straight eyebrows slightly furrowed. Suddenly, her fingers shot out like lightning and forcefully tapped Sulu's chest. With a muffled thud, the severely unconscious Sulu didn't react at all. You actually ignored my warning and tried to reconnect the broken meridians. You really aren't afraid of death, you really have guts. Huai Chaosher retracted her fingers and lightly rubbed them, confirming that the medic's judgment was correct. This small-eyed man in front of her probably wouldn't stand up again in this lifetime. She thought of those continuous escapes and battles in the mulberry tree sea, but she didn't feel sentimental or sad, because she never had the slightest bit of sympathy for her enemies. She only felt that it was a pity. There weren't many people in this universe who had the qualifications to fight side by side with her, and the only one who had ever fought side by side with her was Sulu, who had vomited blood and fainted. The cooperation between the world's #1 mech fighter and the world's #1 mech mechanic was such a breathtaking and satisfying battle scene. From today onwards, there probably wouldn't be another. Send him to the first Imperial Hospital and transfer him to the Royal Special Forces to guard him. Huai Chaosher closed her eyes and thought for a moment, then made a decision, try to save him. The first noble rebellion in the Empire in 100 years started from the shock and suspicion of the royal family, and this feeling also started from the strange death of County King Carlton. Now this rebellion was about to disappear, but to completely eliminate the fear and suspicion of the huge noble class, especially the neutral noble class, the royal family really needed a living Sulu, and then let him die for everyone to see. Many popular science and science books would mention near-death experiences, saying that at the moment of death human beings would look back at the past at the fastest speed, feel the present and look forward. Sorry, there was no future here. Only a high-speed retreating hole condensed by a black wall, and on the other side of the hole was a pure white world, completely different from the bloodstains when human beings were born. Sulu had never believed in this saying. This semi-illiterate who didn't finish the Federation's legal education was filled with mechanical principles and a mechanical worldview. In his opinion, there was not much difference between human beings and the stray cats that ate leftover beef outside the mine, except for aesthetics. How could they have the privilege to reread their lives before they died? Then what would the near-death experience of the stray cats be like? Countless fat, big-eared rats? Even though the uncle had taught him the 10 postures, and the scorching, magical, trembling power was running through his body like countless fat rats, he still maintained an absolutely simple view of materialism. He sorrowfully and stubbornly believed that there was no heaven above his head, only the sky and the stars. Heaven could only be found in life. Sure enough, there was no black hole or holy white light, but there was a black dream, a very unoriginal black dream. However, the old charter computer didn't appear in the dream, wearing an old butler's uniform or really wearing a black silk skirt to talk about some mysterious things. In the black dream there was only the painful tearing of the halo, the scattering of the breath, and no rebirth, gradually quieting down. Suicide was a very simple thing, and surviving was also a very simple thing, especially for a young man who had experienced countless life and death situations, and whose body muscles and organs were extremely strong. All he needed to do was to try hard to open his eyes. Sulu opened his eyes with difficulty, and the light in the gap of his eyelids gradually dimmed and became clear. There was a majestic oil painting on the wall, and the signature below it was so messy that no one had any impulse to identify it. "He's awake!" Along with this surprised shout, there were dense and chaotic footsteps in the ward, and the nervous voices of the treatment team. All kinds of advanced medical equipment were connected to his body. The metal contact should be very cold on his bare skin. Sulu, who had a very unpleasant past in the Federation Army General Hospital, thought silently in his heart, and then his body subconsciously prepared to tremble. However, he couldn't tremble. He didn't even feel a trace of coldness. Only now did he realize that his body was completely out of the control of his brain, and he couldn't feel anything. He furrowed his brows. Fortunately, he could still move his brows, so he should be able to close his eyes. Lying on the hospital bed, Sulu opened his mouth and smiled happily. This smile that came back from death instantly shocked the people of the Empire in the ward, and made them collectively speechless. A few days later. "I warned you, your Junshi has already been scattered by me, and the meridians in the upper circulation have been blocked. If you try to force a breakthrough, only death will await you." Hui Chaoshu stood by the bed with her hands behind her back. She looked at Sulu on the bed, looked at his extremely thin cheeks, and said expressionlessly, "I really didn't expect that you would actually use this as a means of suicide." Sulu smiled and didn't say anything. Now his entire body was paralyzed and he could only move above his neck. Other than speaking, he could only use his expression to express his thoughts. He could no longer imitate President Pabre and forcefully wave his right arm to help his emotions rise. A human's expression could only choose between laughing and crying, joy and sadness, happiness and depression, calmness and depression, and these two opposite camps. So Sulu naturally chose the former. "According to the judgment of the doctor and me, you will never be able to stand up again in this life." Hui Chaoshu looked at him and said indifferently, "How does it feel to be paralyzed? You can no longer carry the prosthetic arm to display your talent. Do you regret it?" "Why do I feel like your highness has more regrets than me?" Sulu, with his thin cheeks, finally opened his mouth to speak. His voice was extremely hoarse and weak. He said, "The feeling of being paralyzed and is a bit fresh. From the file, I can't judge that you are a hopeless optimist." Hui Chaoshu turned around, poured herself a cup of coffee and said casually, "That's because I have never fallen into hopeless despair, so I can't display my talent in this area." Hui Chaoshu turned around with the coffee cup in her hand. After a moment of silence she suddenly asked, "If you had died that day, and now you are paralyzed, would you really be willing?" Hearing this, Sulu was silent for a long time. He stared straight at the snow-white ceiling until the corners of his mouth lifted into a trace of a complicated and indescribable smile. Only then did he reply in a low and hoarse voice, "Of course I wouldn't be willing. I still have a lot of things I haven't done, a lot of secrets I don't know." "For example?" Hui Chaoshu took a sip of coffee. "You have seen my file, so you should know about Zhang Xiaoming. Your first love." "That's right." Su Li's eyes narrowed. He sighed softly and said, "I used to always want to make love with her one more time before I die. Now it seems that I don't have the chance. This is probably the biggest unwillingness." Hearing this unexpected answer, Hui Chaoshu was moved. She asked, Why not your national girl Jian Shuer? Of course, in my opinion, among those ambiguous women in the Federation, only that female engineer Nutshell is worth dating. Without waiting for Su Li's reply, this imperial princess, who had never been in a relationship before, thought that she understood something. She shook her head and said, "Stupid first love complex." Sulu smiled and didn't explain. In the entire universe, probably only the prince of the Tai family knew the real reason for this kind of unwillingness. Since you are unwilling, why do you want to commit suicide? Since you are a hopeless optimist, I always thought that you would persist until the end, at least until the execution. The Federation's proverb says that if the Grim Reaper tells you to report at 3 o'clock, you will never see the first ray of sunlight again. But I am a soldier. Even if I am facing the Grim Reaper, I have to compete with him in terms of strength. After a moment of silence, Sulu replied, "You want me to go to the execution ground and let a lot of people watch me die. I don't know the specific reason, but if you want something, I will make sure that you don't get it. At least I can choose the method of death and the time of death. Until the moment of death, soldiers should fight. Suicide is actually a kind of battle." Chapter 605. The three sentences were like three hard stones that jumped out of the air, smashed into the ground and then bounced up. Even if they eventually shattered, they refused to be deformed in the slightest. Their valiance and stubbornness were hard to describe. Huai Chaoshu was silent for a moment. She, who was confident and arrogant under her ordinary face, did not care about the impassioned Su Lu on the sickbed at all. However, when she heard the three stiff sentences, she could not help but feel a sense of vigilance. If the soldiers of the Federation were all tough people like this, the war that was about to come might not be easy to fight. "I promised you that I would let you die with dignity." She put down the coffee cup in her hand, looked at his unusually thin face, and said slowly, "Since you believe that this way of dying is not dignified, and have decided on another way yourself, I can only accept it. If a completely paralyzed captive cannot provide the corresponding benefits for the Empire will naturally not keep you for nothing. I can't say that I look forward to the arrival of that day, because there is no one who is not afraid of death. However, since that day is bound to come, there is actually not much meaning to what you are saying." Far away from his home galaxy, alone in the depths of the Empire's enemy territory, Su Lu, whose life and death were unpredictable, or perhaps destined to die, seemed to have found some of the shadow of the orphan on the clock tower street back then in his last moments. He raised his eyebrows, looked at Huai Chaoshu with a rather playful smile, and said, "However, it seems that you have won that bet. The bet between you and me was not fair from the beginning." Huai Chaoshu replied. Then she took out a small booklet and asked, "This is what we found on you when we captured you. Can you explain it?" Sulu glanced at the old booklet, and his thoughts instantly returned to the planet full of ice and snow before the new year like a movie. After being captured and brought to the Empire's Tianjing planet, he had never seen the sky above the enemy's headquarters. He had only seen the endless darkness and the snow-white ceiling of the ward. The people around him were all enemies, and the air was filled with the smell of a foreign land. He missed the past more than any other moment in his life. The subordinates of the 7th Division, the small team of the Nutshell Engineering Department, the mecha group that silently advanced in the snow. He even missed the monster Iron 7th Division trained by Du Shaoqing, the Highland Valley at 3,320 meters, the Glacier Forest at 5,460 meters, the road lost in the snow and the deep pits beside the road, the corpses of countless Federation civilians in the pits, the diary of an Empire officer, and the gray eyes of a little Federation girl that couldn't close. "I believe you have already read this booklet," Sulu replied. "This officer named Arthur was executed by your own people because he was unwilling to carry out the Expeditionary Army's order to kill. I have to say, he's the first person from the Empire that I wouldn't describe as a beast." Huai Chaoshu narrowed her eyes, and the coldness gradually grew. But she didn't say anything. Sulu didn't seem to feel that pair of cold eyes at all. He continued to frown and said, "You asked me earlier about my unwillingness. In fact, I really do have a lot of unwillingness." He calmly looked into Huai Chaoshu's eyes and said, You are the butchers of the universe. It's a great regret that I can't completely destroy you. Huai Chaoshu was silent for a moment, then shook her head and said with slight mockery, I thought that after taking you to Liban to read our textbooks, you would have a relatively objective and clear understanding of history. I didn't expect you to still be a piece of trash that was brainwashed by the Federation. Don't you think it's a bit ridiculous for the Empire's princess to say the words brainwashing to a Federation citizen? Or do you think that the role of the Imperial Expeditionary Forces Royal Supervision Group is only to direct the chorus? Sulu refuted without any trace of politeness. This is war. Huai Chaoshu coldly said. There has never been a just war in the history of the universe, especially when this war is between the Empire and the Federation. You have even less of a moral chip to take out. War is naturally only war. George Carlin has said this many times. Sulu stared into her eyes and said, but war is definitely not about slaughtering civilians. Your Federation's army isn't all a model of morality like you. The mockery on Huai Chaoshu's lips grew even stronger. If you flip through the history of the Empire's resistance against invasion, you can find countless examples that show that your comrades are actually no different from wild beasts. Sulu was silent for a very long time. Then he slowly replied, what's wrong is wrong. This has nothing to do with who's wrong or which camp they belong to. If you encountered this kind of situation in the army, how would you deal with it? Huai Chaoshu looked at him like she was looking at an idiot. I don't know. Sulu replied very honestly. But don't misunderstand. I'm playing the role of a moral pretentious prick right now. I've always lived according to my habits. Whether it was assassinating Macklin or fighting you on the front lines of the Westwoods, I simply thought that these things should be done, so I did it. Prince Macklin is the most outstanding member of the royal family in the history of the Empire. And he is also my uncle, Huai Chaoshu said calmly. Thank you. Sulu said very seriously. With these two simple sentences, he understood the true identity of the seed of the Empire who had died under his pen. He also understood that for him to have killed Macklin with his own hands to have a relatively dignified death, this princess by his bedside must have put in a lot of effort. Huai Chaoshu gently placed the diary of the Empire's military officer on the table, then looked at the old diary cover in silence for a long time. Perhaps she was imagining everything that had happened in the Westwoods that year in her mind. The temperature in the ward is not bad. She woke up from her thoughts and looked at the beads of sweat on Suli's forehead. She said calmly, do you feel very hot? At this moment, beads of sweat the size of soybeans were continuously pouring out from the roots of Suli's hair, and then dripping down from the corners of his eyebrows, instantly wetting the entire pillow. His thin cheeks were abnormally pale, and his tightly pursed thin lips were trembling nonstop, but the smile in his eyes was still so natural. Not hot. Suli's voice became more and more hoarse. Huai Chaoshu finally could not help but frown and shake her head. She said, why hold it in? After saying this, she turned and left the ward. Just as the ward door closed, Suli's spirit suddenly relaxed. Although his paralyzed body could not show anything, the sweat pouring out of his thick black hair suddenly increased. His brows were tightly furrowed, and there was no longer any smile on his face. His lips were painfully pulled open, revealing a mouthful of white teeth. Blood continuously seeped out of his gums, making him look extremely wretched. Ever since he woke up from his near-death coma, he had been enduring immense pain. His body could not move, but his internal senses had become even more sensitive. The collapsed power channel had become countless sharp fragments, wantonly cutting in all directions. His nervous system had been severely damaged, but he could very sadly clearly feel the pain of these small knives cutting into his flesh. There was also the mysterious burning power that had finally broken through the barrier. Although it was no longer suppressed by the power of Huai Chaoshu's finger, it could no longer be controlled. It ran up and down his body chaotically, turning into thousands of tiny scalding whips that lashed at every cell in his body, making him feel even the tiniest sensation. It was not a death by dismemberment, but it was even worse than that. Suli's pain was unbearable. Even if he gritted his teeth until they were broken, he could not hold on for much longer. If Huai Chaoshu had not left just now, He might not have been able to hold on any longer. In order to die with dignity, one must first ensure one's own dignity. He insisted on this, so he smiled and mocked the conversation, refusing to let the muscles on his cheeks twitch because of the endless pain. Sweat flowed down his body like a river, wetting his pillow and bedding for an entire night. It was only when the unfamiliar morning light of Tianjing seeped in through the window that he, whose face was extremely pale and weak, realized that he had been fighting that kind of pain for an entire night. How many people in this world could endure this kind of pain? To be able to endure something that ordinary people could not, they were naturally not ordinary people. This kind of person would most likely achieve great things in the end, as long as they did not die in an accident in their career. This was because they had too strong of a willpower and will that supported them to fight to the death against something that they could not endure. Su Lu could endure it because he was unwilling. He had not worn his general's uniform and returned to the dark and boring Donglin mining area to take a look at the cafe, the pub, the library, the big recuperation center, the long-legged policewoman and the police officer called Bao Long Tao. He had not seen the men and women on S1 complete their stories. Taizuan had not gotten married. How was Miss Bai going to wrap things up? Would Zhou carry little Lu Hua and stand under that building to wait for someone to return home? He had not personally caressed Jian Shui'er's black hair. He had not once again used Shang Qiu's greatness to warm his lonely right hand. He had not yet returned the kindness of that beautiful girl. He had not yet found out the truth behind that uncle's death. He had not yet driven the turbocharged MXT to the road in the middle of Lin Mountain to have a crazy race with that bunch of idiotic sons of the senators. He had not yet concealed his identity and gone to some crazy place to dance and have fun. He had not yet forced Bai Magnolia to cut off that annoying strand of hair that floated in front of his forehead. He had not yet brought Xiong Linquan to carry De Lin's gun to help De Wenxi snatch his sister from the 13th floor. He had not yet gotten sick of singing that song with Shi Qinghai. He had not yet had the time to tell everyone that he was Su Lu, the orphan of Donglin Su Lu, and not the soldier Su Lu. How could he be willing to die? Suicide was a battle, but it was also a new gamble. In a situation where he had nothing to lose, he could only gamble with his own life on this last gamble. With difficulty, he turned his head to look at the first ray of morning light from the willow tree outside the window. Su Lu breathed rapidly and tiredly. An abnormal blush appeared on his pale face. In the Empire, this ray of morning light should be called the white belly of a fish. Only a dead fish would show its ugly white belly to fishermen or tourists. He was not dead yet. This was good. Chapter 606. The maple trees outside the window were moving, and the wind was blowing through the treetops. The morning light shone in through the window and onto the hospital bed. The nervous system in his body was fine, but the complicated and elusive energy channels that flowed around the nerves were broken. The injury, which was indescribable, had successfully interfered with the transmission of information from the nerves. As a result, there was an additional paralyzed and weak patient on the hospital bed. The ants that rose in the morning under the old trees, the birds that sang in the breeze, the cracks in the sturdy building walls, and the people who were watching from behind the walls. Everything on Tianjing planet seemed to be moving, except for the frail and weak body on the hospital bed. Fortunately, his heart could move. As long as his heart could move, it was fine. As the thoughts in the deepest part of his mind revolved, the paralyzed body on the hospital bed seemed to move in a space that was connected to reality, yet was completely separated from it. Raising his knees, extending his arms, twisting his waist, lowering his hips, bending his elbows, the 10 strange postures that were imprinted in his mind were slowly displayed one by one. The familiar burning and trembling sensation finally appeared once again. Although it only appeared in his mind, it still made him feel extremely relieved. The barrier that Huai Chaosher had struck into his body with a strange method was shattered, because he had gambled with his life. The burning power that had been blocked for many days was like a flood that had suddenly been freed. It fiercely surged out, smashing the dam and scattering to every corner of his body without any sense of direction. Then it transformed into sharp knives and thin whips that whipped and cut his sensitive areas, bringing him endless pain. However, at this moment, following the postures in his mind, the speed at which the flood spread around his body seemed to have slowed down a little. The sharp knives that were cutting everywhere seemed to have become a little blunt, and the thin whips that were whipping randomly seemed to have become a little shorter by an inch. Although this change was extremely subtle, it was extremely clear to Sulu, who had to constantly resist the unbearable pain. He didn't know how all of this had happened, but he knew that changes were ultimately good things. However, it seemed that the scattered fragments of power had some kind of innate resistance to this kind of request. Every time he tried to pull back the fragments of power that were far away from the fixed channel, his spirit would be greatly depleted. Moreover, it was like holding a sharp blade with one's bare hands. It was so painful that it was dripping with blood, incessantly and vividly, to the extent that it was unbearable. Sulu, who was lying on the hospital bed, was well aware of this principle. He closed his eyes tightly and cautiously experienced this feeling. He valiantly and resolutely endured the more and more terrible pain. This pain made his pair of dark eyebrows deeply furrow, like an idiot thinking about a philosophical problem. Beads of sweat the size of soybeans converged into a river and flowed down, instantly drenching the clothes and sheet. After an unknown amount of time, Sulu finally opened his eyes. His eyes, which were usually sincere, amiable, and bright when he was in the Federation, were now filled with endless exhaustion. There was even a trace of fear and regret that was rarely seen in him. This kind of pain was too terrible. It wasn't like using a bare hand to hold a sharp blade. To be more precise, it was like a newborn baby's delicate hand holding a sharp blade that had been burned red. Every time his mind came into contact with the scattered power in his body, it would produce a similar feeling. During this process, how many times had he come into contact with this kind of thing? Again, how many people in the world could endure this kind of pain? He was the most persevering Donglin stone of the younger generation. However, under this round of increasingly painful torture, the moss on the stone's surface had already peeled off, and cracks had already appeared on the stone's surface. It was about to collapse and scatter. Under the influence of his will, the scattered burning fragments in his weak body gradually slowed down the speed at which they spread. It was like the universe in the later stages of the Big Bang suddenly ushering in a long period of peace. However, this kind of change was, after all, minute. Sulu didn't know how many more times he had to endure this kind of pain before he could achieve his goal. He didn't even know why he was doing this. Why was his will able to gather the scattered power? Or was this just his own hallucination under the pain? As an engineer officer who had received a materialistic education from a young age and whose dream was to become a mechanic officer, this was indeed a very big problem during Sang Shuhai's escape. Hui Chaosher, in order to ensure that this Federation mechanic genius could maintain his ability to move and keep up with her pace, had once seriously warned him not to attempt to break through the Jinchi restriction she had planted in his fingertips. Reality proved that this warning was true. However, Sulu had no other choice. The next day, he was to be executed in front of the royal palace. He had to take this risk. If he didn't succeed, he would become a ghost. At the very least, he would become a ghost with dignity, a combat ghost who made it difficult for the Empire's people's political ideas to be realized. If he succeeded, once he recovered the mysterious power in his body, then he would have a much better chance of escaping the Empire's control. He had no choice but to throw himself into this gamble, and he had to throw himself into it completely. Unfortunately, the result of a suicide attempt to break through the Jinchi restriction couldn't be said to be success or failure. He didn't die, but he also couldn't recover his strength. His entire body lay paralyzed on the bed, but he still didn't despair. Feng Yu had once taught him that the human body was a machine of the first order. He didn't know what ate rice was, what Jinchi was, and he didn't know that the Empire's royal family had meridians. However, he could describe the channels of the burning power in his body with his eyes closed. He could describe the flow of power with extremely precise numerical differences. He could accurately draw countless three-dimensional structural diagrams in his mind, just like how he deconstructed the MX mecha. Perhaps the three major systems of the human body were more complicated and even difficult to understand compared to metals such as mecha and battleships. However, he was Su Lu, a mechanic genius that even Feng Yu secretly sighed with emotion. Just like repairing a mecha, he began to repair his own body. However, repairing the arm became a thought in his mind. In the past, probably no one had ever thought of such a solution to the problem. Li Pifu didn't, Feng Yu didn't, the strong people of the empire didn't, no one. Because they weren't Su Lu, they weren't the guy who had lived with a mechanical arm since childhood and dealt with machines all his life. There were many body cultivation halls in Philadelphia. Did body cultivation halls mean to repair the body? However, it seemed that he had never heard of a body cultivation hall cultivating someone like him. Even Mr. Tian only had amazing skills and strength. Su Lu looked at the snow-white ceiling and thought silently. Huai Chaosher hadn't been here for many days. As the imperial princess and the highest-ranking officer of the Royal Intelligence Agency, she definitely had to deal with countless affairs, especially when the rebellion of the nobles had not been completely quelled. Several imperial doctors were quietly analyzing the state of his body beside the bed. The pain in his body was still constantly invading and destroying his will. If he didn't force himself to remember the past, he was really worried that he would faint from the pain. Other than recalling the past and secretly repairing his body, he spent most of his time thinking. He thought about the Federation Constitution, the computer problem, and his own problems. After all, the more he thought about it, the more confused and inconceivable he became. According to his personality, he usually didn't want to spend too much time thinking about things that he couldn't understand. However, he was paralyzed in bed right now. There was too much time and too much pain, so he didn't want to spend his days without thinking. The Imperial medical team didn't notice the subtle changes in his body. They only found that this captive of the Federation often had problems with the electrolyte balance. If they didn't save him in time, there were many times when he almost died due to excessive dehydration and circulation problems in his body. During these dozens of days, there were often nobles of the empire who came to visit. Occasionally, there would also be people from the Imperial Military Department who came to torture some information. Fortunately, because of Huai Chaosher's promise, he didn't suffer much. In fact, compared to the endless pain in his body, he didn't mind drinking some spicy water to distract himself. Other than that, no one in the hospital dared to talk to him on the bed, including the two female nurses from the empire who had lush hair but were still beautiful. Only the snow-white ceiling and the pungent smell of antiseptic accompanied him. The maple trees outside the window were red, but Su Lu couldn't see them. He could only infer this result from the faint light reflected from the snow-white ceiling. He didn't know how long he had stayed in this hospital. At the beginning, he still had the mood to count the days and take deep breaths to welcome the morning light every day. However, the repeated pain made him numb, and the overlapping loneliness made him depressed. The counting of days didn't last long. Su Lu knew very well that this kind of days wouldn't last long. Once the Empire confirmed that he couldn't be squeezed out anything from him and couldn't stand up again as a target to explain to the nobles, he would naturally be killed. No matter how rich the nobles of the Empire were, they wouldn't raise a useless captive of the enemy. On a very ordinary day, the door of the ward was opened. A team of fully armed elite soldiers of the Empire walked in and took control of the entire ward in silence. Was it time? Su Lu watched this scene with narrowed eyes. He took a deep breath and waited calmly and weakly. His right index finger covered by the bedsheet trembled slightly. At this moment, several nobles of the Empire in luxurious clothes walked in. One of them was about 40 years old. He looked at him on the bed expressionlessly and said, "Although a disabled person shouldn't be able to grasp the relevant etiquette, I still hope that you can learn something. Otherwise, you'll definitely know that being paralyzed is not the most painful thing in the world." The Federation language this person spoke was extremely awkward. Su Lu replied hoarsely, "I can understand the Empire language." "Very good." The official raised his eyebrows in surprise and said, "You should be mentally prepared. His Majesty wants to see you." Hearing this, Su Lu was extremely surprised. Why did the Emperor want to see him? But he immediately calmed himself down. After a moment of silence, he said with difficulty, "I don't think this is an honor." This was not an honor but an opportunity. The index finger under the bedsheet slowly relaxed and then became motionless. Chapter 607. It was around autumn. Red and yellow leaves covered the streets and alleys of Tianjing Planet. For light green jet cylinders flew past the treetops at a low altitude, like the tip of a pen brushing past the bright colors. Then they landed at an airport outside the center of the capital city. The group changed to military vehicles and headed toward the center of the city, along the spacious high-grade roads that extended in all directions like a spider web. They arrived at their destination in the afternoon. The majestic and cold side door of the palace slowly opened, and a group of guards wearing royal military uniforms walked out. They silently took a moving self-restraining bed from the fleet and headed into the depths of the palace. The white restraints were like spider silk, tightly binding the thin, weak, and paralyzed young foreigner on the moving bed, making him look like an insect that was about to be sucked to death. Along the way, the Empire's people didn't use equipment to control Su Li's vision and hearing. He was finally able to take a look at this city that only existed in the imagination of the Federation people. The Empire's capital city of Tianjing Planet. The vast maple forest on the outskirts of the city, the extraordinarily wide highways, and the unique architecture all brought him a great shock. It must be known that although the Federation had paid a great price to obtain an image of this huge city, very few people were able to see it with their own eyes. However, all the Federation people who had seen the capital city of Tianjing Planet should be dead, right? Su Lu was very clear that no matter what the Emperor's intentions were for summoning him, death was already very close to his body. Being able to see the Empire's capital city before his death and feel the atmosphere that the Federation people would rarely experience in their entire lives, according to his inherent nature, his eyes should emit a greedy and emotional glow. However, there was only calmness in this pair of small eyes today. Even though his heart was shaken when he saw this majestic palace that was known as the most magnificent human building in the universe, he controlled his facial expression extremely well. The Empire's soldiers who were pushing the bed into the depths of the palace noticed the calmness of this Federation captive, and couldn't help but have a strange feeling. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the huge cylindrical alloy building that pierced through the clouds in the distance. He guessed that it was probably the palace where the Emperor lived in the rumors. He was shocked again, but the expression on his face became colder and colder. How many truly important moments in a person's life could there be? Marriage, childbirth, funeral. Today he, a soldier of the Federation, was going to meet the Federation's greatest enemy, the warmongering, arrogant, and cruel Emperor of the Empire. If he didn't pretend now, when would he? At this moment, he missed the wide sunglasses that Zhou Yu had given him. He felt that he should be Du Shaoqing, riding the maglev elevator that had long been forced to eliminate by the Federation's Energy Management Committee because of its huge energy consumption. It did not take long for them to reach the sky from the ground of the palace that was full of flowers, trees, and surveillance equipment. It was really the heavens. The sun in the distance moved slowly toward the horizon. The clouds just had a hint of sunset aura. Golden light rose, red, and people seemed to be floating outside the building. It gave people a feeling that they were within reach. Those who lived here day and night, no matter how firm and steady their minds were, would still be moved higher and higher by the distance from the ground and the drifting clouds around them. They would become more and more indifferent. They would become more and more used to looking down on the common people and take it as a lifelong pleasure. With a hint of criticism, the tightly bound Su Lu turned his neck with difficulty and retracted his gaze from the clouds outside the palace. He narrowed his eyes and looked into the darkness in front of him, looking at the back figure in the depths of the darkness. That figure belonged to a middle-aged man. He wore a robe and sat on a soft couch. He held a golden sword in his hand and did not look back. A screen blocked in front of the soft couch. There were golden sunflowers painted on it. At this time, the sunset outside the building reflected the golden light, making the screen seem like it was going to burn. The sunflowers seemed like they were going to come to life. However, all of the dim light fell on the middle-aged man's back and became dim. It was because he was the Emperor of the Empire, the man with the greatest power in the universe. No one in the Federation had ever seen the Emperor's true appearance. They only knew that he was called Huai Fuchai, the 79th emperor of the empire's White Hibiscus dynasty, the unmatched monarch of the entire left sky star region. In reality, not even the empire's ordinary nobles and commoners knew what their emperor looked like. Ever since he ascended the throne, he had never appeared in any of the empire's media, nor were there any images leaked out. The Federation's research concluded that this emperor was deliberately maintaining a sense of mystery in front of his subjects. This was to facilitate the protection of the imperial family's shaky rule. In many relatively strange discussions, people even called this emperor and the intelligence chief of the Green Dragon Mountain anti-government army as the two most mysterious people in the universe. Sulu did not believe this. In his opinion, that uncle with a mouthful of rotten teeth was the one who truly deserved the word mysterious. But as a soldier of the Federation, to be able to see the Emperor of the Empire with his own eyes and come into contact with him at such a close distance, how could he not be excited? As the screen of golden sunflowers grew closer and closer, that robed figure grew clearer and clearer. Sulu grew more and more nervous. Ever since he fled Donglin, he had seen many powerful figures with extraordinary auras. He was also a frequent guest at the presidential residence's private banquets. However, for some reason, he always felt that the emperor under that robe gave him a particularly strong sense of oppression. Was it the smell of power or the smell of death? Was it the identity of the emperor or this person himself? Sulu could not tell clearly, but he could be sure that in his entire life, it was probably only when he first saw the war godly Pifu in Qingqing's military prison that his mind would be shaken like this. Behind the screen stood Huai Chaoshi. In front of the soft couch, there was a white-haired aristocrat of the empire. He was half bowing and softly saying something. The emperor under the robe slowly raised his right arm. This simple movement was enough to stop the millions of soldiers at the same time. The faint mist outside the palace seemed to have paused for a moment. The aristocrat's narration came to an abrupt end. The emperor's voice was a bit low, like a thick book being blown by the wind. Did you kill Prince Delin? Yes. Sulu did not look at Huai Chaoshi behind the screen. Narrowing his eyes, he stared at the back of the emperor and answered calmly, as if he was answering a small question in a cooking program. Did you activate the charter on 3320? Yes. Did you kill Prince Carlton? Yes. The emperor did not turn his head. His eyes should have fallen on that old aristocrat. He let out a few strange laughs. What's the relationship between you and Nasri? Never heard of him. Well, I heard that his last name was Fengyu over there? The emperor slowly turned around. His face was cold and graceful. Hearing the last question, Su Li's pupils suddenly shrank. He felt that the band around his neck suddenly tightened, making it difficult for him to breathe. You're tuning into the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.